It seems that everything possible has already been told about the good old NES. The history of this legendary console has already been discussed to the smallest detail, and its games have been completed countless times. But still, one sight of such well-known pixel landscapes evokes such a wave of nostalgia that it is impossible not to share it. Therefore, Channel DREAMCAST has prepared a huge video about our favorite consoles. Here, you can remember something pleasant from the past with us and maybe even learn something new. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. Sit back, the video will be heartwarming.
And you can play them only on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
In order not to repeat too much after my colleagues, I will only briefly recall the main points in the history of the development of the NES. After releasing several popular arcade machines in the early 1980s, Nintendo decided to make its home console. As a result, in 1983, the legendary Family Computer, or Famicom, was released in Japan. The new platform delighted the players of the time. It supported a resolution of 256x240, which was the standard for 8-bit set-top boxes, and a palette of 54 colors, 16 of which were simultaneously displayed on the screen. This beauty was accompanied by a 5-channel sound. There were 2 channels with a square wave, 1 triangular, 1 noise, and 1 for special sounds. This 8-bit game console went on to take over 90% of the home console market in Japan. In America and Europe, the Famicom was called the Nintendo Entertainment System and had a completely different form factor. The designers tried to make the American model as different as possible from all previous consoles, because just a year before that, the local video game market collapsed with a bang. Stores simply did not want to buy consoles, being afraid to be left with useless goods in their hands. Therefore, the NES most of all resembled the VCR, the same flat, square body and loading the cartridge from the front. The console looked, to put it mildly, not very futuristic. And since the engineers did not calculate the potential strength and carelessness of the target audience, its connector wore out a lot from careless handling. After that, the contact began to disappear in it, and the ability to load the game began to depend on the position of the stars. However, ease of use and design did the trick, and literally within a year, NES became the most popular console in the world. This was also facilitated by game support, a large assortment of games, and regularly released new titles. I think it's time to remember them. Why else would we be here? The NES library is just overflowing with golden hits, and of course, there is no other option but to start with the Super Mario Bros. I hope everyone is familiar with the Lady in Distress storyline, but just in case, let me remind you. The turtle-like King Bowser kidnaps a beautiful princess named Peach, so Mario, or well, his brother Luigi, sets off to the Mushroom Kingdom to defeat all the Koopas and save the unfortunate girl. The original game consists of 8 worlds, each of which contains dozens of interesting secrets. Take for example the warp zones with teleportations to other locations. After passing the last world, the game does not end. You are given a second quest, which is actually a new Game Plus mode. There are fewer checkpoints, locations become more dangerous, and opponents move at an even greater speed. It's not like Super Mario Bros. Is an easy game itself, but playing through the hard modes can be compared to the gaming experience you get from any part of Dark Souls. Only rolling was not brought here, but you can hit bricks with your hand instead, which is a fair trade for me. A no less iconic game is run-and-gun action Contra. First of all, I can say that for its time, the game was quite difficult. If you could get to Gromades, a giant alien monster in a waterfall location, then you could already be considered a fairly skilled player. Well, the one who managed to defeat him could become a legend among friends. The game was so hardcore, I suppose the arcade past of the series can be blamed for this. Marketing geniuses often made the game harder by adding hundreds of enemies, turrets, and traps to each level to shake the poor gamer out of their money. However, my friends and I always wanted to kick the developer's ass and show who was in charge, so we looked for all sorts of tricks. The most famous, of course, was the Konami code, which gave 30 lives. Now, it may seem casual, but in those days it was a necessary step to at least see the final level. Another shooting game, Duck Hunt, was very different from Contra, but just as emotionally charged. This is a classic light gun shooter where you have to shoot ducks flying out of the grass. In total, the game offers 3 modes. In the first, 1 duck flies on the screen, in the second, there are already 2 of them, and in the third, you just need to shoot at the plates. In general, a regular shooting range. If you manage to hit a bird, then a dog with prey peeps out of the grass. If not, it also appears, but it laughs at you. You know, so viciously and mockingly, you can literally hear it in her laughter. Don't be upset. Try again. You will succeed. In fact, no, because you're a loser, take a break from games and give the gun to your older brother. Sorry, some childhood memories flooded back. By the way, did you know that in Duck Hunt, you can play not only as a hunter, but also as a duck? All this time, the second player could control the flying 8-bit bird with the help of an additional controller. This discovery greatly surprised those who thought they knew the game inside and out. I hope that for you, it turned out to make the video a little more informative. Ice Climber is one of my favorite platform games, where you control Popo and Nana, 2 children in Eskimo parkas. The game was the debut work of Japanese programmer Kazuaki Moriata. He considered it a warm-up for some big project with the mustachioed plumber in the title role, which we already remember today. There was no large-scale plot. A bird steals precious vegetables from the main characters and flies to the top, and all that remains for them is to take a mallet and make their way up, encountering polar bears or fur seals. Of course, the higher we climb, the harder the obstacles. The game is extremely cute and childish, no shoutouts and battles, just a couple of Eskimos trying to return their food. It sounds as harmless as possible, and this favorably singled her out against the background of many different action games. For example, such as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a platform game based on comics and cartoons about Ninja Turtles by Konami. A team of brothers consisting of Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Donatello set off to rescue their friend April, who was kidnapped by the main villain of the Turtles, Shredder. One of the features of this action game is that you can switch between characters at any time, and each of them has a unique weapon. As for me, Donatello was the most imbalanced. After all, he wielded a long bow staff, so I was keeping him for the bosses. Although, I like him the most as a character, he's the brain and mind of the whole team. If during the walk through the health of one of the heroes reached a critical level, you had the opportunity to change the character to another and not lose him, and so as many times as you like, until each of the turtles is knocked out, and only then, game over. Go start the level from the very beginning. I should say that sometimes the game was ridiculously unfair. Just remember those electric algae and bombs. However, I kept playing it over and over and even replayed it a few times because I liked the game so much. Also, I enjoyed the soundtrack so much that I even later listened to it separately from the game. For me, the biggest drawback of a TMNT is the lack of co-op. I mean, we can complete the game with 4 turtles, but the developers haven't added a co-op mode? Fortunately, they added it in the following parts, including my favorite, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Hyperstone Heist for SEGA, but we'll talk about it sometimes next time. Disney games on NES stand apart. They were almost always bright, cheerful, and close to the original movies exactly as much as needed. One such example is the platformer DuckTales, created by the famous Capcom. The developers understood that they were faced with an important task: to release a quality product that every cartoon fan should want to buy. And it seems to me, they did a great job. Bright graphics, favorite characters from TV screens, and unique locations, including the Amazon, the African mines, the Himalayas, Transylvania, and even the moon. DuckTales was created by cartoon lovers for cartoon lovers. Even the storyline seems to be complemented the animated series because it is based on the crazy passion of Scrooge McDuck to travel and search for lost treasures. The uniqueness of the game lies in the weapon of the protagonist. With the help of a seemingly ordinary cane, Uncle Scrooge can make high jumps to overcome obstacles and fight enemies. It's nice that after more than 20 years, the developers have released an updated version for modern platforms. It turned out, by the way, no worse than the original game, so if you're scared off by pixel graphics, be sure to check out the remake. But I like the Darkwing Duck more. He always stood out from the weekend cartoons. This Drake with Batman and James Bond traits was, well, cool. He had vehicles, a bunch of gadgets, and the signature style. Against cheerful DuckTales, Aladdin, or Chip and Dale, it was a real noir. The game turned out to be the same. Eternal night, a lone detective, wary of life, one-on-one with a cold, indifferent city, ready to devour anyone who sticks a careless beak out of the nest. No, of course, this is not such a dark thing, but definitely atmospheric. It had everything, a great 2D platformer with shooting needed. For example, different ammo for the gas pistol and a wide range of enemies, each requiring a different approach. Of course, there was also great music. The 8-bit version of the opening of the animated series was made especially well. But what was not here was the passwords to the levels. If you already started for the Darkwing Duck, then you had to go through it to the end in one go. And even though this game was easier than Mega Man, from which the game was made, I would still like to have passwords. But as you may know, not all games on the NES resembled children's cartoons. Suffice it to say that this is where the main horror platform series of the last 35 years was born. In contrast to the Disney cartoons, Mario and some Master Higgins, Castlevania looked sullen, like a goth in kindergarten. Moreover, there was even a more or less large-scale plot, according to which the first part of the epic about the Belmont clan and its confrontation with Dracula ended up being the 7th. In general, a serious, adult, and, no kidding here, really atmospheric thing. Although, there was nothing incredible in terms of gameplay, this game was mesmerizing with style and atmosphere. Not fists or a blaster, but a whip as the main weapon. The scenery of a huge vampire castle, evil spirits of all sorts and sizes as opponents, bosses with design that makes you want to tattoo yourself out of any of them, and of course, brutal complexity. Castlevania, of course, is not the same as before, but now it plays well, and it just sounds so amazing. What can we say about the good old days when it was unsettling to play it alone late at night? Yes, in those days it was a cool horror. The last thing I would like to end my nostalgic story is Battletoads. Some may call this game the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles clone, and they will be absolutely right. Battletoads was created precisely as a competitor to TMNT. Although, these amphibians have almost more charisma than the legendary 4, so the clone turned out just great. In genre terms, it was a classic beat-em-up, but amphibians didn't just punch enemies in the face, they had to climb rocks, swim, and most importantly, ride bikes. Ah, that turbo tunnel. Compared to it, the famous Fairplay from the first Mafia is just a cakewalk. Of course, the game did not provide any passwords or cheat codes, so most of my acquaintances threw it at the level with the races. Yes, it is also perhaps the most difficult game of its time, and on 8-bit consoles, the competition, as you know, is pretty tough. To be honest, I've never reached the end, and I don't know a single person who would have done it. And you? Emulators with quick saves don't count, you know. However, despite the hardcore, Battletoads has long been the best place to kick some butts with a giant boot. Well, that's my memories of the NES and its wonderful games. Of course, this is only a small part of what is worth mentioning, so I invite you to the comment. Tell us about your favorite 8-bit titles. We're just starting our series and the next video will remember the arch rival of NES, SEGA Genesis. Eight-bit game consoles in general, and the Nintendo Entertainment System in particular, have left us with many fond memories. Moreover, with its appearance, NES completely divided the gaming industry into before and after. But a few years later, we faced a brand new console. At first, of course, it was difficult to understand what was unusual about it, well, except for the design. But ad commercials very quickly explained how much the new console is better and more advanced. Then, when most of us heard those two syllables that to this day remain on hearing, SEGA.
Genesis from SEGA. Genesis, the new generation in video games.
By the 1989, the NES had ruled the video game market for the last 5 years, and it was time for a new system to take the throne. SEGA's Master System, despite its graphic superiority over the NES, did not make a proper impression on the US market. SEGA knew that its next system would not only have to outperform its competitors, but also gain the support of independent game makers. The lack of such support was one of the main reasons for the failure of the Master System. After 2 years of development, SEGA introduced its next generation system, known as Genesis, in the West and Mega Drive in the East. It was the first game console to feature a fully 16-bit processor as well as 8-bit digital to analog converters for audio. SEGA was released in 1989 as a variant of the home arcade game machine. For that time, the graphics and sound of the SEGA Mega Drive were just perfect. A huge number of games have been remade for the console from arcades, which is why a large part of the Genesis library is arcade. SEGA was equipped with the Motorola 68000 processor with a clock frequency of 7.8 MHz, which, again, was an excellent indicator for that time. For example, the processor speed of the classic Spectrum was about 3.5 MHz. Even despite some restrictions in the simultaneous display of colors on the screen, there were 512 of them in total, 64 were displayed simultaneously. Games, even in comparison with the NES, blew the imagination.
Dave, we got your golden axe!
Or get Genesis by SEGA. We bring the arcade experience home.
A great example of such a game is Comix Zone. One glance at the game is enough to understand this is a real interactive comic. The plot of the game is surprisingly original. Lightning strikes the house of an artist named Sketch Turner. Then, he finds himself in his comic book. The main villain, on the contrary, escaped to the real world. Fortunately, he cannot fully become real while our hero is alive. This is where our adventure begins, in which we moved through the panels, fought monsters, and tried to make it to the final of the drawn story. For someone working with music and comics, Sketch is a surprisingly good fighter. He can not only hit his opponents quite powerfully, but even perform some unusual moves. The villain doesn't rest either, and he can even finish drawing a new monster so that the adventure does not seem easy to us. The trouble here is that Sketch is a real human, and everything drawn hurts him, including his blows to opponents. True, this rather makes you think once again about the tactics of the battle than it irritates. Of the minuses of the game, I can only recall a short duration, only 3 levels. But what 3 levels? In a word, this is one of the most classic games for SEGA. Also, it's one with which I would recommend starting acquaintance with the console. Speaking of classic games, one cannot fail to mention SEGA's answer to Mario, the most famous hedgehog in the world, Sonic. This is where the series started, which remains active to this day. The brand new console needed its mascot, cooler, more dynamic, and more youthful than the plumber and his princess. And looking even at the first game in the series, it's hard to say that the developers failed to do this. I still remember how I launched Sonic 1 for the first time after leisurely walks in the Mushroom Kingdom. I figured out the controls a little and flew through the first level of the game in just a minute. It felt like after a kick scooter, I was immediately put on a motorcycle. I don't think that anyone is unaware, but just in case, let me remind you of the plot. In all the main games of the series, we need to run through levels, reaching the finish line and collecting rings along the way, without which Sonic loses his life from any damage. From time to time, we meet bosses, various machines of the evil Dr. Eggman. By the way, here he was called by his original surname, Dr. Robotnik. The sequels only expanded and improved this game formula. It was even more fun to play the second part of the series, especially since his constant companion, Tails, is now running with Sonic. And the third seemed to be the pinnacle of the development of such games. Small cutscenes, many levels, including a secret one, amazing music. Here, one can spend a lot of time describing how it turned out to develop the initially good idea of the first Sonic. so I think this is a good topic for a separate video. In terms of game development, it's interesting to look at the series that we first saw on NES, and then their sequels were released on SEGA and Super Nintendo. And for me, this is a good reason to remember the Contra series. The SEGA part was called Contra Hard Cops. The plot of the game is about the same as on NES. We still protect the Earth from an alien threat, shooting at the invaders from a whole arsenal of varying degrees of steepness. The substance has not changed, but details have. Now we have 4 different characters to choose from, an extensive level system with choices for the development of the plot, several endings with separate levels and bosses, and all this in a dark and even brutal atmosphere of the war for humanity. Even the music at the first level allows you to understand that this time everything is really serious. You can feel the progress of the gaming industry by comparing, for example, bosses. The bosses of the first and second Contra were large, dangerous, but generally static and not very diverse in combat. Here, the bosses can rush around the screen, actively move, and attack in a variety of ways. And not only that, these bosses were thrown at us one by one, each time turning the battle into a whole fun event. For example, it could be a shootout on a sheer wall or running from a robot along a highway, and it was necessary to run not from left to right, but straight into the screen. It felt like we were in action scenes from our favorite cartoon, or maybe even from a movie. By the way, games similar to animated cartoons were also not uncommon on SEGA. The most obvious example is The Lion King, which many of us have played, but here I want to remember the games about the worm Jim, especially since a cartoon about him was also made later. The plot of this colorful and surreal game is quite simple. Once upon a time, there was an ordinary earthworm named Jim. Nothing foreshadowed trouble, but the super suit fell on him. And here we have one of the most unusual heroes that we saw in childhood. And then, according to the precepts of the classic heroes, we set off to save the princess. Of course, the numerous abilities of both the costume and Jim himself will help us in this. What do you think? For example, about using Jim's body to cling to hooks and thus overcome pits. Sure, developers did not deprive us of the opportunity to shoot from a blaster, which probably came with the suit. I especially remember its enhanced version, which brings back pleasant memories of defeating bosses in a few shots. But still, the most interesting thing is not even this, but the levels that the game offers to go through. Jim travels to different planets, among which we are waiting for a junkyard planet, a fiery planet, a laboratory planet, and the nightmare of all old school gamers, a planet consisting of a huge underwater level. It's good that we avoided a collision with her relative, a planet consisting of a slippery icy level. The crazy flight of fantasy of the developers is well supported by the graphics. I think that I will not be too mistaken if I call Earthworm Jim one of the most beautiful games on SEGA. Shinobi 3, Return of the Ninja Master was just as beautifully drawn, albeit in a very different style. This is a classic action game about a ninjutsu master named Joe Musashi and his fight against the crime syndicate. As you would expect from such a character, Joe is not only skilled with a sword and kunai, but he can also use several superpowers, make a lightning shield for himself for a while, increase his mobility and jump height, damage all enemies on the screen, and even sacrifice life to make such damage even stronger. The game surprises us in terms of the mobility of our character as well. We had to jump, including pushing off walls, climbing ropes and ceilings, riding a horse and surfboard, and all this back in 1993. Compared to previous games in its series, the third game has become so smooth and beautiful that the game can easily be called cinematic. By the way, the same applies to locations, because the game starts like a classic Japanese movie. Forests, caves, opponents with shuriken and swords. And then we seem to move into a cool action movie. Military bases, laboratories, they shoot at us, various monsters attack, well, everything that the word cool could be associated with in our childhood. Speaking of action movies in Sega, it's hard not to remember Mortal Kombat with a kind word. Of course, the first few parts of the series were not only on Sega, but also on Super Nintendo, but I remember the series just more on this console. It is unlikely that anyone has not heard about the Mortal Kombat tournament and about the evil Emperor Shao Kahn, who wants to take over the Earth realm. Yes, and we launched the game not for the plot. Dynamic and quite brutal for that time battles. That's what blew my mind and many of my friends. Previously, fighting games could only boast of slightly faster action compared to other games, while here, an unprepared fighter could not even keep track of how a hail of blows poured at him. And it was even more difficult to fight back, because Mortal Kombat brazenly used all 6 buttons of the Sega gamepad for combat and made difficult combinations of them for tricks and finishing moves, and they still had to be learned for each character. By the way, about the characters, the wealth of choice can surprise even now, even if a solid part of the heroes were recolored male and female ninjas. Like most guys, the choice of my favorite character was not unexpected. I played as Scorpion. Teleportation and the classic spear attack reminded me of my favorite Oriental action movies, so I had no other choice. And who did you play for? Or maybe even now you play? Write in the comments and let's share our experience. It is worth mentioning that different Mortal Kombat games have become less spectacular when ported to Sega. The graphics got worse, some finishers and even the fighters did not get to us. But who cared? As if the lack of animality, a special finishing move when a fighter turns into an animal, prevented us from organizing yard tournaments where we found out who is cooler, Scorpion or Sub-Zero. Well, when someone abused the same blow in battles, the tournament could go into the real world, but this is not a story for this series of videos. Sega could surprise us with quite unusual games for its time. The best example of this would be Dune 2: Battle for Arrakis. This was one of the first real-time strategy games, and for many, including myself, the very first. Nothing like this we could see in other games. We managed the construction and economy of an entire base, the recruitment of troops to command, and fought in real time. Of course, now it does not sound so breakthrough, but at the time when we were running as Mario or Sonic around the screen, it already seemed pretty cool. Dune looked like something completely new in the world of video games. The Dune universe has an impressive history. Armies of 3 different dynasties fell on the planet of the same name, where each has its own history and its own views on this world, but ultimately we need to conquer the entire territory in pursuit of a valuable resource: spice. 3 different dynasties provide us with 3 different armies, more mobile, heavier, or something balanced. It was in Dune that many of the ideas that still exist in strategies were born, ranging from such a division of races or factions to the fog of war, the interface with the map, gradually opening technologies and troops, and much more. As for me, I only would like to add here the opportunity to play this game with one of my friends, since there was no multiplayer. By the way, there was a funny story that we discussed for a long time in our circle. The game is called Dune 2, and for a long time we could not understand. We saw all 3 Mortal Kombat, some even heard about the first parts of Shinobi, but none of us knew anything about the existence of the first Dune. As it turned out later, we would not have been able to find out because the first Dune was released on computers, which were still not so common at that time. So this game brought us not only one of the most unusual gameplays of its time, but also such a mystery. As you may have noticed, I talked about almost all these games with the words cool and unusual, and that was the whole Sega Mega Drive. After the fun and charming worlds I saw on the NES, Sega showed that games can be more brutal and mature. It would be unfair to say that Sega is better than NES. Of course, technological progress and the development of a series of games speak about this, but in my mind, Sega gave a different perspective on games, and I really like that perspective. The year was 1987. The NES was doing just fine on the market, and it seemed that nothing could ever challenge Nintendo's dominance. But the influence of NES prompted many game companies to develop their own, better gaming consoles. After witnessing the rise of Sega Genesis and the instant success of the console in North America, Nintendo reluctantly admitted that it was finally time to act. The efforts resulted in the new console known as Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Please get comfortable, as today we'll continue to reminisce about the 16-bit era.
Only with Super Nintendo, and it's like nothing you've ever faced. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
To begin with, both the Famicom and the NES were planned to have a 16-bit processor. However, due to its high cost, it was decided to equip the device with the good old 8-bit one. Obviously, this didn't prevent the console from occupying 90% of the market, absolutely dwarfing the competitors. All of this made the company kind of lazy and limp, to the point where its representatives were saying, "We don't hasten with the new console as we're sure that the NES will be able to hold the bar just fine." Meanwhile, the competitors weren't resting on their oars. Many tried to challenge the Japanese colossus, and among them were two most influential systems. First, the TurboGrafx-16, aka PC Engine from Hudson Soft, released in 1987. This gaming system essentially introduced the fourth generation of consoles, albeit without much of a success. But still, it was an important step for the gaming industry. The second console was of course the Sega Genesis from Sega, which was the topic of one of our previous videos. If by any chance you missed it, be sure to take a look for the context of the whole story. Sega not only showed excellent graphics, color, and modernity, contrary to the aging NES, but was also actively smearing the image of Nintendo. Thus began a full-blown console war. All of it forced Nintendo to admit that it was time to set foot in the fourth generation. The development of SNES went relatively smoothly. Nintendo kept the same designers as with the NES. Masayuki Uemura took the lead in developing the SNES for the Japanese market, while Lance Barr was the designer for the North American market. Uemura started working on SNES in August 1988, the same month that the company essentially announced that they would be fighting Genesis and TurboGrafx to take back their throne. All the hard work eventually paid off, as the SNES was showing a better picture than the Sega Mega Drive, both color-wise and in terms of different variants of background and object movements in the game. The system supported video effects and such previously unbelievable features as rotation, transparency, zooming, stretching, compression, and sprite rotation. No other system could do this. The color range was absolutely enormous for the time. Not every graphics card was capable of supporting it. The standard back then was 256 colors. The sound was also out of this world. In 1990, the Super Famicom could casually synthesize music and voice. But of course, there were significant memory limitations. The cartridge slot could extend the capabilities of the console to an extent where it was capable of running rather primitive but real 3D games, provided that the cartridges had the needed co-processors. Speaking of games, it's about time we get to them. Here, I can't help but mention Contra once again. The series' newest game, Contra 3: The Alien Wars, was first released for the SNES before the Sega. Remember that aggressive courage and brutality of fighting aliens? Well, now we have a well-traced and, I dare say, detailed battlefield full of eye-catching effects. Yet the game didn't lose all its gloominess on the Nintendo console. We were still surrounded by enemies and given an impressive arsenal to fight back. I'm sure there's no need in talking about the story, as its core remained the same. The gameplay was a bit poorer here than on the rival consoles. For example, we had two identical characters to choose from instead of 4 different ones, and you could carry only 2 weapons instead of 4. But that's hardly surprising, if you keep in mind that Part 3 and Hardcore were actually 2 years apart, and the developers certainly didn't waste that time. We didn't get into all the chronology, but the Sega installment actually came out way earlier. Some of my friends would even passionately try to prove me that Contra 3 was the continuation of what was on Sega. However, in large part, this was also because of the advantages of the SNES itself that made the game more technically advanced. First of all, it was the music that the console could play. After buzzing techno rock, we were greeted by epic symphonic compositions, within the capabilities of a 16-bit console of course. And secondly, a unique Super Nintendo feature, which we'll get back to later, the so-called Mode 7, a graphics mode that allowed you to scale and rotate the background layer. In Outgame, for example, there was a whole level with rotating whirlpools of sand tied to it. This level ended with the boss, which on higher difficulties was completely surrounded by these rotating sands. I better not mention how many headaches I got trying to beat it. Continuing with the topic of the game series, why not have a look at how Castlevania was holding up? By that time, they had released a new game, and not just any game, but Super Castlevania 4. By the way, there were quite a lot of SNES games that had the word Super. I suggest you to write down in the comments what other Super games were there. But anyways, here, once again we have vampire hunter Simon Belmont's quest to invade Count Dracula's castle and slay its master. Yes, don't be surprised, it's sort of a remake of what we had already done back on the NES in the first game. Compared to the original Castlevania, here we have a more agile character. You can now use your whip in all directions, and this one is hard to believe. You can change the direction of the movement mid-jump. Such acrobatics were previously unknown to the Belmonts. Mode 7 did his fair share as well by giving Simon the ability to swing on hooks using his whip. There were even these spots that combined whip swinging and rotating environment. I'm pretty sure there's no need to mention how beautiful the game was. You can see everything on the screen. But since we're talking about graphical and such, we're simply obliged to mention the rotating tower level. You could see that such beauty was a bit too much even for Super Nintendo. The game would always stutter if an enemy would show up on the screen, but for me, it has always been just an extra opportunity to admire a truly immense location. Even that 3D tunnel was nothing compared to what I saw in Donkey Kong Country. Unlike the beautiful but still two-dimensional characters of SEGA and NES, Donkey Kong looked truly 3D and wasn't repulsive like early 3D games, like the ones on Sony PlayStation. Apart from pretty visuals, the game also had a pleasant classic gameplay. As usual, we would run around collecting various stuff, mostly bananas, while trying to avoid enemies. As for the interesting features, you could switch between two characters whenever you pleased. The Kong team, including Donkey Kong himself, was the biggest and the strongest and could deal with larger opponents, and Diddy Kong, who could jump farther and run faster. Also, when I finally got acquainted with the game, I remember being blown away by the sheer amount of secrets scattered throughout each level. At one point, it felt like I wasn't playing a new cartoonish action game, but something closer to The Legend of Zelda, where you had to scour each level in search of various nooks and crannies. Speaking of Zelda, we still haven't said a word about it, and it's high time we fix it. The magnificent The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is still considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. And when you start playing it, it becomes extremely hard to disagree. What we have is a huge adventure for its time, in which young Link has to save Princess Zelda and the Kingdom of Hyrule. It's worth noting that all the confusion in the series began here, as the third part was a prequel to the first two. Naturally, there were some gameplay improvements, such as multi-level dungeons, new gear like the grappling hook, and the game itself looked and sounded much better. But it wasn't all this that made it so memorable. It was the story. Unlike the usual, you're a tough guy with a mighty weapon, now beat 10 levels to get to the big and sinky meanie and kick his ass, Zelda offered a captivating story which deserves its own video. In a nutshell, the synopsis is that Zelda telepathically asks Link for help. She is kept in a dungeon by an evil sorcerer who has seized power over the kingdom and is about to unleash an evil that has been sealed away long time ago. But Link can't get to the villain right away, so he sets off on a perilous journey through the kingdom, where he'll have to search for artifacts, solve puzzles, and fight dangerous monsters. A little fun fact to better understand the scale of the game: Contra 3 takes about half an hour or an hour to beat, if it's not your first time playing. A Link to the Past, on the other hand, requires about 5 hours, and that's just for the story speedrun. But these are the 5 hours that I certainly recommend spending. Another series that had multiplied the greatness of an already gorgeous original is Metroid. And as with Zelda, it's absolutely well deserved. The story here is less twisted, but no less fascinating. A bounty hunter named Samus rescues a Metroid larva stolen from its space colony. It's an alien race that feeds on the life energy of the organisms. The fact that the larva bonded with the girl and perceived her as its mother only adds to the story's drama and sets the tone for the adventure. The key feature of the game was the progression. The game had this huge location, part of which were blocked off, and the player had to find various upgrades for the character to access new spots. Such upgrades could give new weapons to fight the hostile fauna or new abilities for Samus, like the ability to curl into a ball. This type of progression became known as Metroidvania, which then gave birth to a whole genre of games. I'm sure you've heard about it. This feature is also widely known as I've already searched all available locations and used all the available abilities. Where the heck am I supposed to go? Surely, you all had this experience at least once in such games. Feel free to share with us in the comments what game it was and how did you eventually figure out what to do next. While talking about Super Nintendo, it's mandatory to mention one more game. And no, it's not Mario, as there's so many parts that they deserve their own video. I'd like to end the topic with Star Fox. Back then, it really surprised everyone, including me, by being truly 3D. While almost all other known games had 2D pictures and backgrounds, even Donkey Kong was no exception. Here, we had a truly volumetric spaceship flying in space and fighting equally volumetric enemies. Of course, it was still a long way from the beauty of Uncharted, but even the few polygons that the ship consisted of made me go bonkers. The rest of the game was also up to par. The story told us about an evil scientist who started conquering a fictional planet system out of greed, and a team of pilots called Star Fox whose mission is to stop him. The development of the story and who the anthropomorphic pilots would encounter depended on the choice of the 3 mission branches. After making the choice, you had to complete several missions that consisted of flying around, shooting enemies, picking up boosters, and, of course, cherishing the 3D technologies of 1993. This is perhaps the most striking example of how much Super Nintendo could surprise us. And by looking at such examples that were actually quite common, you begin to understand that the commercials and articles of those years wanted to convey so avidly. Sure, the SNES also had, shall I say, rather simple games that weren't anything special, although still quite fun, but it were these 16-bit wonders that made the new Nintendo console a true technical revolution and not just another gadget in the line. The 4th generation was quite the time to be alive. It may seem that we've honored both Nintendo and SEGA and now it's time to move on. But in our videos, we often mentioned a full-blown war between these 2 consoles and never gave this topic proper attention. Time to finally fix it. The confrontation between the 2 giants of the game industry began even before the world saw the 16-bit consoles. On one special day, July 15, 1983 to be more precise, 2 great 8-bit consoles were released in Japan. The Famicom from Nintendo and the SG-1000 from SEGA. Both consoles are considered to have been successful, but of course, cognition comes from comparison. The Famicom possessed a more powerful hardware and had more interesting games. Plus, Nintendo themselves were pulling out all the stops to get the upper hand. For example, not allowing developers to release games for the other consoles simultaneously with theirs. As for the Famicom itself, we know its American and European version as Nintendo Entertainment System. Meanwhile, Sega wasn't giving up and released the 8-bit Sega Mark III in Japan, which later came to America as the Sega Master System. Everything seemed to be well. The console was more powerful than NES, it had some pretty good games, but then the competitor had already established on the market firmly enough to prevent the relatively small Sega's American marketing team from taking down the mammoth of the 8-bit era. On the other hand, there was still the European market, where the Master System successfully one-upped Nintendo. And in order to secure their positions on the key markets, Japan and the US, Sega's engineers started developing the next console right after the release of the Master System. And at that time happened an event that not only changed the fate of the future console, but also marked the beginning of the 16-bit era, the release of the PC Engine gaming system from NEC. To call the PC Engine, known in North America as TurboGrafx 16, innovative would be an understatement. A 16-bit graphics processor allowed to simultaneously display 482 colors. For comparison, the NES could boast only 25, so the developers had to go great lengths to make the picture beautiful. Another interesting fact is that the PC Engine originally used its own cartridges, but then came an additional device called CD-ROM 2, or TurboGrafx CD, which allowed to launch games on discs for the first time in history. But most importantly, the new console had quite an impressive library of games. Double Dragon 2, Bonk's Adventure, Splatterhouse, Legendary Axe, New Adventure Island, and of course, the game that still makes the console worth having, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. It actually was an amazing gaming system, worthy to be remembered along with other members of that generation, especially since the courage of the developers who decided to oppose the two Japanese giants proved to have been worth it. At one point, NEC took almost a third of the Japanese video game market, but unfortunately, the developers had some mistakes in design and marketing, and such mistakes are unforgivable when your competitors are Sega and Nintendo. For example, there was an irrepressible craving for innovation which caused NEC to release newer and newer versions of PC Engine. In the end, they were unable to nail down their success, and the sworn enemies were once again left 1-1. Meanwhile, Sega looked at the release of the PC Engine and decided that it was time for them to enter the 16-bit era as well. The decision resulted in the good old Sega Mega Drive. We've already covered this console and its great game in separate video, so in case you haven't watched it, I suggest you bring yourself up to speed. As for today's topic, it's safe to say that the Mega Drive had a rather peculiar launch. In the fall of 1988, the new Sega was released in Japan, and less than a year later, the console came to the American market under a new name of Sega Genesis. As I said earlier, the outsourced marketing of the Master System didn't prove to be exactly successful in America, so Sega took the role of a comic villain and decided that if you want something done right, you gotta do it by yourself. The promotion of Genesis in America was epic, to say the least. Sega already had the image of Nintendo's arch enemy, and the company didn't hesitate to use it. First of all, this became apparent in the new aggressive commercials. The promos were pretty straightforward, literally saying that Genesis does what Nintendo does not.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo.
At that time, this was like if Sega's CEO came to the office of a Nintendo CEO, took off his glove and slapped him in the face. Sega used every opportunity to talk about how their console was better than Nintendo's both technically and in terms of games. It all got to the point where Sega games got their own seal of quality, a symbol similar to that of Nintendo games. Except that, for the big N, this stamp meant that the company took responsibility for every product they released and were putting their reputation at stake. This was needed to resist the infamous collapse of the video game market, when low-quality titles started to pop up like mushrooms after rain and investors were simply afraid to pour in their money. Because of that, developers had to face lots of restrictions and inspections before releasing their games on the NES. While Sega's quality seal's only purpose was to teal us, Sega does the same thing that Nintendo does, only without the quality assurance hassle. Another part of the master plan to conquer the American market was to squeeze everything possible out of Sega's arcade past. A quick historical fact: while developing the Mega Drive, the technical basis was taken from the Sega System 16 arcade video game. It would seem to be an easy opportunity to take the already popular games, only the rights to such arcade games were mainly owned by Nintendo. To solve the problem, new, not so original games were spiced up with numerous celebrity names of the time. The most notable example of celebrity involvement was the game called Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. The fact that I didn't mention this game in the corresponding video hints that the game wasn't so much quality. Yes, it's a beat 'em up where we play as the king of pop himself, but even such an incredible idea needs an interesting gameplay. In the end, we can say that this aggressive marketing strategy actually worked, but not nearly as effective as expected. After all, Genesis was unable to undermine the NES. Besides, on the 7th year of existence, the old 8-bit console had already pulled every ace out of its sleeve, and it was the NES's decline in popularity that finally prompted Nintendo to think about kicking the door down to the 16-bit era as well. Yes, this is where the perfect Super Nintendo game system, aka Super Famicom, the Japanese version, comes into the picture. The untarnished reputation of both the company and the previous console was enough for the new device to instantly start recapturing the Japanese market and going to America 9 months later. Of course, the console also got a redesign and a new name, the familiar Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES. However, SEGA was not going to give up so easily. By this time, it had been doing quite well in the Japanese market for 2 years and in the American market for 1 year. And SEGA was actively using it. Another marketing campaign was launched with a goal to show that SEGA already has 1,000 games, while the SNES has little to nothing. Well, except for Super Mario World that was being sold with the console.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
We kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog, more action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
I know that I sound like a diehard Mario boy, but don't let it deceive you. I respect Sega, and the Mega Drive will always have a special place in my heart. But this marketing campaign? For example, Sega actively advertised the Genesis feature called Blast Processing. When asked what makes Genesis the best console, the answer was simple: Blast Processing. What that shtick really was is debated even today. There are 3 main versions. First, it was a fake term that was a marketing trick. 2, it meant that the Genesis could quickly scroll the graphics on the screen, which was true. And finally 3, that it was an actual thing that was never used in any of the games. True or not, all 3 versions illustrate the same point. Sega gladly took every marketing opportunity, no matter how questionable they were. But what definitely wasn't a bad move was the creation of a mascot that became just as iconic as the world-famous Mario. We're talking about Sonic, of course. The image of a supersonic hedgehog was created with almost scientific accuracy. The idea paid off more than one could have ever imagined, allowing Sega to take over 65% of the American market. Sonic was featured in numerous commercials, and even the console itself now came with the awesome first Sonic in contrast to the mediocre Altered Beast. Meanwhile, the SNES was just selling. I mean, Nintendo wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. For example, the legendary Street Fighter II was much smoother on their console than on the one from Sega, but all in all, the Super Famicom didn't show us any aggression towards Sega. What it did show were games that never ceased to surprise us. They were even among the first ones to use 3D graphics. We have a separate video about this as well, and without it, your knowledge about the world of 16-bit entertainment would remain incomplete, so be sure to check it out if you haven't already. As for our console wars, SNES quickly caught up and vanquished their competitor without any violence. The main weapon was the sheer quality and the reputation of the company. By the way, it should also be said that in the American market, the Genesis was still more successful than its rival from Nintendo. And so, the giants of the video game industry would have fought one another unto eternity. But one day a new challenger appeared on the horizon who was about to change everything. In an attempt to continue the competition, Sega began to develop add-ons for the Genesis, Sega 32X and Sega CD. They expanded the capabilities of the console, allowing it to run more demanding games. The second add-on could also work with discs. This didn't result in any great success, but Nintendo also started developing a CD drive for the SNES. While working on it, they signed a contract with a certain company called SONY. Yes, you already know how it's gonna end. But still, at the beginning, Sony were actually working on this project and were even going to present the SNES CD gaming console. By the way, there's even a prototype of this thing, which looks peculiar to say the least. However, Nintendo reread the contract, realized that Sony had too many rights, and at the last moment signed a contract with Philips. Sony couldn't tolerate this kind of behavior, and this prompted them to make their own console. The mission of restoring the tarnished Japanese honor was bestowed upon a gaming system whose name is familiar to everyone who knows at least a tiny bit about modern culture: Sony PlayStation. Anyhow, it was Nintendo's huge mistake that entailed the end of the 16-bit era. Ahead was a completely different and new 32-bit story. It all started right where we stopped in the last video. The market was being torn apart by the console wars and Nintendo was striving to make a CD drive for SNES. As always, I strongly advise to watch our previous video to get a better understanding of the picture. Add-on development contract was attributed to Sony, which wasn't interested in video games at the time, yet had already managed to collab with Nintendo while developing an audio chip for SNES. Work went on for several years and resulted in a prototype of a hybrid console called PlayStation. It's the gap between two words that makes the name different from today's variant. Everything was going well, but not long before the CES trade show, where the presentation was supposed to take place, Nintendo reread the contract terms and just changed their minds. They didn't like that Sony was going to get rights for the discs of the new format and consequently a share in profits from video game sales. Thus, on first day of the show, Sony announced the new console as well as collaboration with the Big N, and the next day Nintendo terminated the contract and announced further cooperation with Philips. The event was unpleasant to say the least. But the lads didn't give up and went to SEGA representatives with a proposal. Why not unite against a mutual enemy? However, they were told that Sony doesn't know squat about making game consoles and that SEGA doesn't need any assistance. Sony's executives were furious about the situation. But they weren't simply throwing a tantrum. They put the energy to good use and started working on the stagnating project by themselves. As a result, PlayStation 1 was released in Japan in December 1994 and 6 months later in the US. Sony made sure that its beloved offspring got strong support from game developers, so the starting lineup of titles was a pleasant surprise. From the get-go, one could play a few sports games and racing sims, a shooter, 3 fighting games, a platformer, and even an air battle simulator. We'll talk about the last one in a bit. Remember the dynamic yet simplistic Afterburner? Or the technological and hasteless Star Fox? At the launch of PlayStation, Namco introduced Air Combat, a flight simulator that took all the best of its predecessors. The game proposed us to choose one of the 16 planes and use it to do some missions. The controls of the aircraft were not quite realistic, but that wasn't really an issue. Much more important was the ability to fly in 3D space, being able to freely maneuver wherever you want. You could fly in third person or first person. The second option made it easier to strike your enemies with machine gun fire and missiles. Truth be told, the game's sequel made this game formula even better. It also changed the name of the future series to Ace Combat. After the first game, there is not much that can be said about the second one. They added more planes, the graphics got better, now there was a story connecting missions, and of course, the action became even more dynamic. However, I personally remember this game not even for all of this, but for its soundtrack. After really beautiful 8 and 16-bit compositions, PlayStation indulged us with masterpieces like this. All in all, it is a perfect example of what the new generation of video games was like at the beginning and how it evolved over time. But Namco is remembered not because of the marvelous Ace Combat, but for the Tekken fightings. As much as we spent brawling as two flashy ninjas in Mortal Kombat, so much was spent in the first, second, and especially the third games of this wonderful series. Tekken offered us a whole selection of fighters, each with his own biography and relatively realistic fighting style. True, there wasn't as much magic and weapons as in MK, and the characters were fighting with bare hands, but that didn't make the fights any less spectacular. However, there was an exception to this rule, Ninja Yoshimitsu, who was able to perform a sword slash if he knew which buttons to press. Just like Ace Combat, Tekken possessed a great soundtrack and full 3D, even to the point where in the third game you could simply walk aside from your opponent to dodge. What more could we ask a great fighting game for? Exactly, the ability to play a combat version of volleyball. Yes, Tekken 3 could do that as well. And I can say from my own experience that the battles in this mode were almost fiercer than in the standard game. By the way, I like to play as King, a wrestler in a jaguar mask. In addition to the usual moves, he boasted a whole series of grapples that, if performed well, could take away almost all of his opponent's health bar. I couldn't perform all these grapples, but I was pretty good at some of them, and I was pretty happy with that. And who was your favorite character? Share your main fighter in the comments and let the discussion begin. And I'll move on to the topic of console mascots, which comes up quite often in my videos. Looking at characters like Mario and Sonic, it's easy to understand how the company wants to present its game system. The first PlayStation didn't have an official mascot, but the unofficial one was extremely memorable. His name is Crash Bandicoot. For starters, let me tell you that Bandicoot is an Australian marsupial and, most importantly, existing animal. I've been told about it by my well-read friends, with whom I've had long arguments trying to prove it's a fox. It's about time I apologized to them. I was indeed wrong. Unlike most of his fellow platformers' protagonists, Crash is a kind character, but not laden with noble motives. He was once an ordinary Bandicoot, but one day, evil Dr. Neo Cortex captured him to make the general of his army of modified animals. Things went a little sideways, and instead of high intelligence, Crash was granted with mild insanity, which is quite noticeable on his low polygon cute little face. In the first game of the series, Bandicoot is on a race against time to save his girlfriend, who is held captive by the Doctor. And afterwards, he simply goes on to prevent him from carrying out his villainous plans. And I have to say, it's quite interesting after Princess saving Mario, heroic in his own way, and environment protecting Sonic, to play as a character who seeks adventures just for the sake of it, because he's unable to fathom more complicated matters. The whole buck wildery was complemented by Crash's great moving capabilities, particularly high jumps and iconic spinning. Of course, earlier these spins reminded us of the Tasmanian Devil from Looney Tunes, but here this move was needed to punch numerous enemies and smash even more numerous crates. All of it happened to look so cartoonish and funny that it was impossible to stop. The variety of locations was also a pleasant surprise. Bandicoot could find himself in the jungle, on a river, amidst the ruins of some temple, or in the dark corridors of some castle. In the second game, lively winter and sci-fi locations were added, and to remember where Crash found himself in the third game because of time travel, my oh my. To put it brief, everything we knew about exploration games with cartoonish characters underwent a complete rebirth in 3 dimensions. But I must say, the 2D games were doing great on the new console as well. It's time for our apparently permanent column. How's Castlevania doing? New game, titled Symphony of the Night, was released on PlayStation 1. Remember how in the video about SNES I explained what Metroidvania is? If you don't, I suggest you rewatch it. In a nutshell, it's a game with one huge location that you have to explore to find new items and acquire new abilities, which will help you get to the parts of the map that were previously inaccessible. Back then, Symphony of the Night became the epitome of the genre. All of a sudden, this time we were not given control of Belmont. Instead, we were playing as Count Dracula's son, the mighty Alucard. Actually, we were already given control of Alucard in the third Castlevania. Since then, he has learned a whole bunch of new tricks, sword fencing, various jumps and dashes, not to mention his astonishing repertoire of magical abilities, which is impossible to cover without a separate video. I'll confine myself to mentioning that he can still turn into a bat. The necessity to explore Dracula's castle once again didn't surprise people familiar with the franchise, but the execution of the location was just as mind-blowing as it is now. The castle was filled with numerous secrets, to solve which you had to consult all of your friends. because it was not always obvious where and which of Alucard's many abilities would allow you to move forward. Fights with the undead were still there as well. Ordinary opponents could either be just a minor inconvenience or pose a serious challenge, while the bosses were no joke for sure. Once again, I'd like to give credit to the wonderful soundtrack of Castlevania, which in this game was jeopardized by just one thing: the funny voiceover, as if the sound was recorded in a bathroom.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh.
Still, such goofy moments didn't make the game less great. And if you wanted to see some great staging on the first PlayStation, you turned to various 3D shooters. And here it is a sin not to give credit to Hideo Kojima, who gave us the legendary stealth action Metal Gear Solid. Here's the synopsis. We play as a retired soldier and spy named Solid Snake, who was summoned for a covert operation. Terrorists have put their hands on dangerous nuclear weapons, and Snake, under our control, needs to sneak into their base and stop the villains. Even in a couple of words, this sounds pretty epic. While in the game itself, with all the details and plot twists, this story completely plunged us into the atmosphere of a real spy action movie. Kojima's main idea was to use cinematic techniques in the game, and it's hard to say he didn't achieve his goal. They didn't put eyes on the characters' faces because of the limitations imposed by graphics, but I trusted every word of the low polygon models regardless. The gameplay deserves some appreciation as well. The obvious hide and seek and shootouts were complemented by uncountable details, forcing you to constantly think and analyze your actions. For example, an enemy could spot Snake's footprints left in the snow. In 1998, this was borderline fantasy. The boss named Psycho Mantis deserves a mention of his own. A telepath who can move objects and read minds. Proof the first, he asked the player to put the joystick on the floor, and the vibration indeed made it move. To prove the second, the boss would tell what other games have you played using the saves on your PlayStation's memory card. After tricks like these, talks about a huge two-legged machine capable of launching nuclear missiles didn't seem like something supernatural. For all sorts of weirdness, we would launch another, equally fascinating game, Silent Hill. It is widely seen as a classic horror game, but for me, Silent Hill has always been a pure thriller. The game kicked off slow and calmly. A writer named Harry Mason has just arrived in a foggy American town, searching for his missing daughter. Gradually, we were immersed in the town's history, where a religious cult had a crucial role. The cultists tried to bring their divinity back to life, what slowly but steadily infested the town with paranormal stuff. We were playing as an ordinary man, so he wasn't an excellent marksman, couldn't take too many hits, and didn't have any extraordinary abilities. That's why a silhouette of a monster appearing in the dark or in the fog truly made you fear for your virtual life. The game was abounding with all kinds of symbolisms and metaphors, so you could discuss the interpretation of an enemy for hours on end. However, usually the discussion was focused not so much on monsters as on the game's numerous puzzles and enigmas. Today, you can just watch a walkthrough or read a guide, but back in my time, I had a notebook of 96 sheets, scribbled with these unsolvable puzzles of Silent Hill. Moreover, the game had several endings, and the only way to figure out how to get them was by trial and error. To sum up, the game terrified and confused us, and that's what made it great. A similar approach was adopted by another horror game, Resident Evil. The 8th game of the series was released not so long ago, while on PlayStation 1 there were parts from 1 to 3. Unlike Silent Hill, this game was not a psychological thriller, but rather a B-movie horror game about zombies. But that doesn't mean Resident Evil is worse. It simply chose a different approach from the very beginning. The story told us about a secret lab called Umbrella, experiments of which resulted in the outbreak of a virus that turned people, And not only people really, into bloodthirsty zombies. Now, we took control over more combative characters who knew their way around firearms, but their skills didn't make things much easier. Resident Evil was the first survival horror game that created the genre, where survival meant that you never had enough ammo for all the enemies. You had to think about who to avoid, who to shoot, and who to sacrifice a part of your health bar to. Like both previous games that I've mentioned, Resident Evil was like a peculiar game film, both entertaining and terrifying. Next game in the series also followed this concept, though they executed it differently. But I wandered off to the field of games that make your skin crawl. I suggest we end today's video with something a bit more fun. One of the most popular hobbies at the time when the first PlayStation came out was skateboarding.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
And the Tony Hawk Pro Skater series of games contributed a lot to its popularization. Like all the games we've mentioned, it has also begun its journey from PlayStation 1. At first glance, one might say that the game is just a skater simulator, but that would not be quite right. Pro Skater is a true cultural imprint of the time. Uplifting rock music, skating areas representing famous real places, a whole bunch of renowned skaters and equally renowned skateboard tricks. A virtual time capsule, if you will. However, the game was more than just endless stunts. We were given a location where we had to achieve several goals at once, such as collecting dollars or knocking down different items. The game was also full of unlockable content of all sorts, from just secret places and locations to various cheats, characters and clips. Looking at the sheer list of content, it was impossible not to want to uncover everything the game would allow you to. As a result, Tony Hawk Pro Skater required the same thorough exploration of locations as, say, Castlevania, only here you also had to skate, do stunts and not fall off your skateboard. Needless to say, how many kids tried to master the skateboard in real life after beating the game. Not gonna lie, I was not one of them, but I had friends whom Tony Hawk literally dragged into this hobby. Just a fun fact to sum it all up. This game was made by the same guys who made the classic Spider-Man for the same platform. That's why in the second Pro Skater you can play as Peter Parker and do unusual stunts like pulling your skateboard with web. Looking at today's games alone, you realize that Sony PlayStation 1 had practically rediscovered the world of video games. So many various adventures have we managed to remember in this video, and I'm sure that still everyone has the game that how could I not have mentioned? And that's perfectly fine, because PlayStation's games can be discussed for hours, which is why I humbly invite you to the comment section. Share which PlayStation 1 games you remember the most. Last time we stopped at the moment where Sega Genesis have started to fade, and the company has come up with the move to develop extensions for the 16-bit console. The first of them, Mega CD, was focused on the possibility to use quality music and videos with discs. The whole thing could hardly be called a success. Genesis became flooded with low-quality rail shooters made as movies, and one of the extension's best exclusive games, Sonic CD, stuck to the classic gameplay of past games. Sure, it also had great music and cartoonish cutscenes, but what made the game memorable were not these innovations. Rather, it was just a masterfully made Sonic. The not-so-successful Mega CD experiment, along with the release of the successful 3D Sega games Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter, prompted the company to update. The Japanese and American Sega divisions simultaneously started developing the new Sega Saturn game console, for which we have gathered here today, and an extension for Genesis titles, Sega 32X. It added some power to the console, allowing it to run more technologically advanced games. The extension was supposed to come out before Saturn, but because of the delays, it was released practically alongside with the console. This was yet another fail for Sega for an obvious reason. Why buy an upgrade for an already outdated Mega Drive when the new console has just come out? And it's about time I got to it as well. The development of Saturn wasn't going smoothly. At first, the console's hardware wasn't as powerful and was unable to display 3D graphics the way it should have. Then, the technical characteristics of PS1 were published, and rumor has it that it was because of them Sega's management got so outraged that they insisted that Saturn should get an upgrade. All of it resulted in the console's monstrous design. Several connected processors and 3 video chips with different functions which together were capable of stunning performance. Unfortunately, this became the main issue for game developers, because they had to find an approach to such overcomplicated hardware, and nobody knew how to work with it. And trust me, when game developers can't understand how to make games for your console, you have some really serious problems. Anyway, Sega Saturn hit the stores at the end of 1994, and was even successful at first, largely thanks to the advertising campaign, which I can't help telling you about. The thing is that to promote Saturn in Japan, they came up with a wonderful mascot named Sagara Sanshiro. The premise of these commercials was simple. People would do whatever they do on the daily basis, when suddenly an epic fighter named Sagara would appear and start tossing them around, telling them that they were compelled to play Sega Saturn. Then all hell broke loose. Sagara would outrun a skater on foot, fight an army of zombies, give out the new console as Santa Claus. The man even had his own theme song. As a rule, this madness was somehow related to the particular Sega Saturn game that was being advertised at the time. The mascot story even had its finale. Terrorists have launched a rocket at Sega's office, but Sagara grabbed it with his bare hands and carried it into outer space while saying "Play Sega Saturn" over and over again until the explosion. Indeed, a hero worthy of any console and without whom the story would not have been complete. Be sure to pay the respects in the comments. But if Saturn was doing quite well in Japan, in the US, it was a total disaster. By the time of the American release, Sega had been long since at war with Sony, and their presentations happened at the same E3 1995. The release date for both consoles was originally scheduled for September of that year, when all of a sudden, Sega's representative appeared on stage and said that September was nice, but they have already sent their consoles to the chain stores. You just had to go and purchase one. Obviously, by making such a decision, the developers were striving to get the upper hand against their rivals. However, some rather surprised store representatives told Sega to take a trip to far, far away and stick their amazing moves up their bits. At the same time, all of this has significantly reduced both the amount of advertising and the starting lineup of games which were still supposed to be released in September. The final blow was landed by Sony's presentation, the best one in their history. They listened attentively to Sega with their $400 for the console, all the announcements, benefits, and this charming decision to rush. And then the company's CEO came on stage, looked at the audience and named a single number, $299, and left, accompanied by a mad round of applause. You don't even need to look at the sales numbers, which only confirmed the defeat. However, the financial disaster doesn't mean that the console didn't have any great games. Let's start with the already mentioned Virtua Fighter, which made its way right to home consoles after the success on arcade machines. As you can probably tell, this is a 3-dimensional fighting game, the first one of its kind. Even on the 1993 arcade machines, the game offered a square but quite acceptable 3D graphics and gameplay, which was dynamic even by Tekken standards. By the way, the release of the first Tekken was a year away. By the time of the Sega Saturn release in 1995, Virtua Fighter had slightly spruced up the graphics and got rid of several technical issues. The gameplay rules were standard for the genre. Players fight using various techniques and have to either completely deplete the enemy's health bar or throw him out of the arena. You could choose from a total of 8 fighters and a few almost identical arenas, which was not quite much by the standards of modern fightings. Though back in the day, this was more than enough. To summarize the essence of Virtua Fighter, it was one of the trailblazers, so it was technically simple for players and literally laid the foundations of the future 3D fightings. Today, the game will probably seem way too primitive, and perhaps the only reason to try it out is for the history's sake. But at the time of its release, it was definitely a technological breakthrough. Truth be told, many Saturn games suffered from a kind of primitiveness, and not because of poor quality, but because the 3D era was only beginning back then. Developers had to learn from something, and their experiments were not always successful. The situation with Sonic was very illustrative. Many often accuse Saturn of not having any good games in Sega's greatest mascot, and such accusations are not completely unfounded. Sonic Extreme, a groundbreaking 3D game, was in development as the console's exclusive. It was supposed to have full 3D, bizarre locations, a whole army of various enemies, and much more. But the game ended up in a production hell and didn't come out at all. Instead of Extreme, the console was left with Sonic 3D Blast, a game transferred from Sega Genesis, and with a collection of other games from the same console called Sonic Jam. In the end, Saturn's only exclusive was Sonic R racing game. It would seem that racing genre fits the adventures of the Supersonic Hedgehog perfectly. As future games have shown, this genre indeed fits quite well. But the developers were simply unable to slay the third dimension. The character control was very inconvenient, and the game's physics only made the situation worse. As a result, the player usually spent first couple of hours stumbling at walls and trying to find the right way. Moreover, the game was ridiculously small. Just 10 characters and 4 tracks with only a couple of activities worth doing on them? But to be fair, it must be said that the game looked colorful and unusual. Personally, I would also name its fun soundtrack as one of its strong sides. It was often said to be too weird, but I thought it was just the right thing for the cheerful atmosphere of the early 3D. Sonic's transition to Saturn and the 3 dimensions did not go well. As PlayStation's example has already shown us, if there's a gap, something will fill it, especially the gap of a console mascot. If you missed our video about PS1, I strongly recommend you take a look. Here, it was the creators of Sonic who saved the day by making a new game called Nights into Dreams. The game synopsis is pretty simple. The protagonists, Elliot and Clarice, fight nightmares in the dream world with the assistance of the Dreamkeeper named Nights. The player has to fly around the level, collecting bright multicolored spheres, and fight the boss once the collecting is finished. Sounds simple, but this is the case where there's no need for artificial complications. The gameplay is done well enough to keep the player engaged without snowing him under loads of various mechanics. But the game's length was rather disappointing. All 7 levels, including the final one, took 3 to 4 hours tops. Partially, this problem was solved by the add-on called Christmas Nights, which was distributed on an additional disc. In it, you were able to find 2 modified levels, various Christmas content, and even a Sonic minigame. The add-on was aware of the current date and offered even more surprises, such as the ability to use Knight's adversary named Rila as a playable character when the game is launched on April 1st. By the way, now you can try Nights into Dreams with its add-on without the struggles to find Sega Saturn, because the game was ported to a number of current platforms, which I was extremely happy about. But at the dawn of the 3D era, there were other games besides simple ones. If you wanted action, fights, and shootouts, which Sega has already been known for, it was worth to take a look at Saturn's Die Hard Arcade. It's a 3-dimensional beat-em-up, the first one in history. I'm pretty sure you already noticed that we are constantly stumbling upon pioneer games in this video. Die Hard Arcade was based on the movie Die Hard.
Thanks for the advice.
Which implies that the player had to fight terrorists as John McClane. Although there are plenty of differences as well, such as John saving the president's daughter and not his wife. But who cares when we were given the opportunity to play as Bruce Willis in a classic action movie? As I said earlier, the game cannot be called primitive. For example, I personally was pleased with the variety of different combos and weapons. I was also surprised to see the quick time events mechanic, which many may remember from the Resident Evil series starting from the 4th game, or maybe God of War. The mechanic consisted of buttons that would appear on screen, and if you didn't manage to press them all in time, you would lose a part of your health bar. Such a simplistic feature made the game more cinematic and added to the immersion. It was interesting to find this feature in a 1996 game. I kid you not, but it is also a fairly short game. It's almost as if developing projects for Saturn exhausted the hell out of the developers. As for Die Hard, this adventure required less time to beat than to watch the movie, about an hour. But as with the previous game, the process was fun and definitely worth it. Another fun shooting game I would recommend is Panzer Dragoon. Saturn saw 2 games of the series, the essence of which boils down to flying on a blue dragon and shooting enemies before they shoot you. Simply put, it's a rail shooter like Star Fox. But Panzer Dragoon has an impressive story that tells us about the post-apocalyptic world and the survival of the remaining tribes and nations. The story is told through loading screens between levels, which, together with the ambience of the in-game world and melodic soundtrack, makes you dive into the game. And yes, the length of the title is also about an hour in the first game and 2 to 3 hours in the second. Apart from them, there was also a spin-off called Panzer Dragoon Saga. Not only had it changed the genre of the game from shooter to RPG, but also finally allowed to stay in the game's world for at least a dozen hours. Instead of flying, you now have to walk, including the dragon rides. And instead of shooting, you have to solve puzzles and explore the surroundings. Overall, the game reminded of Final Fantasy, had they added more staging and drama. For example, during fights, the camera would take beautiful angles, and the characters would perform various animations. In general, Panzer Dragoon Saga can be called one of the most technologically advanced Saturn games, both in terms of content and its beauty, as well as the depth of its mechanics. In short, back in the day, people were buying the console for the sake of these 3 games, and didn't have any regrets. I'll end today's video with one more game of this kind. Along with the new Sonic, the new Golden Axe game was expected to come out on Saturn, but it never did. The place of the main 2D beat-em-up game of the console was taken by Guardian Heroes. It seemed to be an extremely classic formula of beat-em-ups. You walk through the levels playing as one of the 5 total characters, smash enemies with unique strikes, and stumble upon bosses from time to time. But the game had a few aces up its sleeve. First, we're talking about the complicated upgrade system. Complicated in a good way, and at the time of the release, of course. Characters received experience and upgraded one of the 6 characteristics affecting their combat effectiveness one way or another. Secondly, although the game was made in 2D, the player could switch between the front and the back of the location, which came in handy both in combat and in exploration. Last but not least was the game's story, which had a decent amount of forks and several endings, allowing the player to stay in Guardian Heroes for another dozen hours, rebeating the story with other choices. A curious player could also stumble upon new levels and even unique bosses. No wonder the development team called the project a combat RPG because of these cool features. So, Sega Saturn had both something to play for a long time and something fun and quick to beat. It's a shame that Sega's technical and marketing mistakes prompted the decline of the company's console career. Sure, the guys have yet to make the great Dreamcast, but the following release of the second PlayStation will finally convince the management that for Sega it is better to concentrate on making games for all consoles. It's hard to say whether this is for the worse or for the best. But either way, we have an interesting story of a company that challenged Nintendo itself and even found considerable success. I invite you in the comments to share your opinion if you'd like to see a new Sega console, as well as your memories associated with the company. Even before Sony joined the console wars, many companies had already started to consider the potential of the new data storage piece, the well-known compact disc or CDs. Their ability to work with larger amounts of data and relatively low production costs clearly spoke not in favor of game cartridges. One of the first companies to utilize CDs was 3DO, created specifically for the development of the eponymous console. Because of the fact that 3DO was founded by representatives of 7 different companies, from Electronic Arts to Gold Star, soon to become LG, these were several versions of the console at the same time, such as Gold Star 3DO, Sanyo 3DO, and the most familiar to us, Panasonic 3DO. Seems like a total mess, but thanks to the contributions from all sides, the console turned out to be not only quite powerful, but also good for game developers to work with. In large part, it was thanks to the company's liberal policy. For example, the console had no regional blocks or copyright protection. You only had to spend your money on the console itself, after which it was only about copying the disc. However, there was still an issue. This time, it was the starting price of $700, because of which the console was considered an entertainment for the rich and posh. The outbreak of piracy, however, was not impressed by the price tag, largely due to the fact that the 3DO library contained some truly great games of its time. The best example was the first part of the well-known series Need for Speed, proudly titled Road and Track presents The Need for Speed. Knowing the series' recent history, it's hard to imagine that it all began back in 1996 on a Panasonic console. As for the first game, it was the same 3-dimensional arcade driving simulator, though without the signature atmosphere of illegal racing. Nonetheless, the game already had traffic and police. You had to not let the police car in front of your car by any means. Otherwise, the wannabe racer would be slowed down for the first time and disqualified from the race for the second. The number of tracks left much to be desired, only 3 to choose from, while the car park offered only 8 cars. Still, it was enough for the audience to fall in love with the first Need for Speed. So much, in fact, that the game received countless sequels and ports to other platforms with additional content. Critics praised the game's excellent graphics, gameplay, and especially realism. It's Need for Speed we're talking about, while ordinary players were very eager to buy discs with the game. A similar story happened with the Gex game series, the first part of which also came out on 3DO. It seemed like one of your typical platformers, only with a cartoonish gecko as the protagonist, but the details made this series stand out. Firstly, the game's plot and setting were pretty unusual. Gex leads the life of a reclusive couch potato, when suddenly a villain named Rez pulls him into the world of TV programs. Naturally, he wants to take over the world, and he needs the gecko as his television network's mascot. The players had to explore the worlds based on various TV genres: horror, adventure, animation, and martial arts movies. Gex had to collect TV remotes in all worlds to open a passageway to the villain's lair, defeat him, and return home. In addition, unlike other cartoonish characters of the time, Gex was constantly narrating what was happening on screen. This made him much more believable character, and the game was more fun. As a gecko, our protagonist had the abilities you would expect: tail swipe, tail jump, clinging to walls and the ceiling, and catching various bonus-giving bugs with its tongue. Just like the NFS, yes, Gex's sequels have also appeared on several other platforms, largely due to the short lifespan of the 3DO support. Many of the game franchises simply outlived their first platform. On the other hand, 3DO could also boast the improved versions of games from other consoles. Here I can immediately think of Road Rush, another racing game only on motorcycles. Originally, Road Rush was released on Genesis, then made it to SEGA CD, Saturn, PC, and of course 3DO. And if in 1991 Road Rush was just a fun and simplistic arcade racing game, then the 1994 version was something that we would call a wonderful remaster. The first thing that caught your eye was the improved graphics and gameplay. What only looked like a ride on a highway on Genesis now was really it. Of course, the animations still weren't exactly smooth, and graphics consisted primarily of sprites, not 3D models, but this did not prevent you from feeling the bike ahead of you and fight with your contenders. By the way, you could not only overtake them, but also attack them with a multitude of weapons. After all, we're not here for official races. Besides the gameplay itself, the game had 8 characters with different stats, a whole fleet of motorcycles, several tracks with increasing difficulty, and most importantly, cool motorcycle videos and rock music that only added to the ambience. In other words, I saw Road Rush as a smaller version of Tony Hawk from the world of bikes. So, the 3DO games were quite impressive. Unfortunately, not only did the high price hinder the sales, but there was also another unpleasant issue. Remember what I said about the console being developer friendly? It opened doors not only for the true masterpieces of its time, but also for a whole torrent of low quality junk. It helped to keep the 3DO running till 1996, then the console support was suspended, gamers lost interest in it and turned to the competitors. Besides, that year saw the release of another console, Nintendo 64. The history of the Big N's response to the Sega-Sony brawl has some curious points as well. Earlier, I told how Nintendo suddenly refused Sony's proposal for joint development of a CD drive for future developments. I would recommend watching our video about PS1 for a complete understanding of what's going on. Nintendo turned to Philips to continue the work, but the CD drive was never finished with them either. At the end of the day, the developers decided to revert back to cartridges, all the more since they also had their edges: durability, piracy protection, and most importantly, instant loading. I bet many remember these moments of meditation in front of the TV while loading certain games on the first PlayStation.
2,000 years later.
Nintendo were rather silent about their project, but eventually announced that the new console would be the first 64-bit gaming system, hence the name, Nintendo Ultra 64, which then lost the word Ultra. Another innovation was the joystick, which not only had a peculiar shape, but also the world's first analog stick with the D-pad arrows. Such joystick design was explained by the strong emphasis on 3D graphics, and PlayStation's DualShock was still a year away. It's about time we remembered how this design was realized in games. And there really is a lot to remember. Of course, I'll start with the game that came with the console, Super Mario 64. The new chapter of the plumber's adventures moved into 3 dimensions.
It's me, Mario!
And the developers did a tremendous job for this transfer to go with the problems of early 3D. The essence remained the same. Mario jumps on his enemies, hits the crates, and saves Princess Peach. However, everything else has changed dramatically. Instead of a map or level-to-level transitions, players were presented with a huge starting location, an empty castle that belonged to the princess. Once in it, you could either select a level by jumping into one of the paintings, or explore the castle's numerous secrets, which made it a level of its own. Mario's abilities became wider to match the game world. The plumber could now not only run, jump and swim, but also crouch, crawl, climb, kick, and punch. Moreover, many types of jumps and power-ups were also added. Such expansion of abilities naturally entailed the development of levels. If previously we were mostly running from left to right, in Mario 64, the player was forced to constantly change the direction, including going up and down the platforms, what made the locations much more diverse. You also had to collect the stars, which could be given for anything from defeating a boss to solving complicated puzzles. All in all, everything that was memorable about previous Marios became better and more varied, and this spoke volumes about the new Nintendo's console's capabilities. The same can be said about the Legend of Zelda sequels. 2 games, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, were released on N64. Link's adventures now also unfold in the 3D world. For what the developers have completely overhauled the character controls. Players were not only given the opportunity to freely control the camera, but also to aim different weapons and even focus on a particular enemy. The ability to look in all directions was tied to the puzzles, for which the series is famous. Though for puzzle solving you would most likely turn to the weapons and abilities, the quantity of which became absolutely insane. The key feature of both games is the Ocarina of Time, a musical instrument that is vital to both game storylines. Link can use the artifact to play tunes that have different effects. The plot of both Ocarina and Majora would be hard to describe even in a separate video, so I'll just say a couple of words about each. In Ocarina of Time, players were told the very beginning of Link's story and his first rescue of the Kingdom of Hyrule from the series' irreplaceable villain Ganondorf. In Majora's Mask, Link finds himself in a parallel world and must prevent a giant moon from clashing with the planet. To sum it all up, I can only say that Ocarina of Time was voted the best video game of all time according to Metacritic. Of course, it can hardly be compared to modern masterpieces, but the game's contribution to the development of the 3D era undoubtedly deserves that title. Another example of a great contribution to the development of the genre is GoldenEye 007. As you have probably guessed, this is a game about the adventures of the world-famous agent James Bond that was based on the movie with the same name. Originally, the GoldenEye adaptation was planned to be a casual 2D exploration game, but the developers decided to try and make a 3D first-person shooter. Back in the day, GoldenEye was pure joy in every conceivable way. First of all, the plot. Although it differs from the movie, still tried to follow it. Thus, for example, Agent 007 had to explore a Russian satellite station, drive around St. Petersburg in a fast tank, and make his way through the jungles of Cuba. Sure, it was a bit less cinematic than the action movie, but it brought back good memories from watching it. Secondly, the game was quite well made as a shooter. The locations allowed for interesting shootouts, and the enemies didn't let you get bored by spicing things up every now and then. And thirdly, GoldenEye left great space for experiments. For example, you were free not to use the tank at all. The stealth lovers could simply crawl through all levels using only a silenced pistol. The cherry on top was the multiplayer up to 4 users, which enabled to have fun firefights before it became Call of Duty. Speaking of multiplayer, I can't help but mention another important game, Super Smash Bros. I'm sure that many of you have at least heard about one of the most recent games of this series, especially since today it's a recognized cyber discipline for competitions. But I'll tell you about the very first game, which was released on the N64. As kids, we loved to fantasize about crossover fights between the various movie and game characters. Take the RoboCop vs Terminator or Alien vs Predator, for example. Super Smash Bros. Provided such possibility within the Nintendo universe. I don't think anyone had ever wondered who was stronger, Pikachu or Donkey Kong. Yet Smash Bros. Made us think about that. Players had to choose one of 12 characters and clash like in a fighting game, but not like in Mortal Kombat or Tekken. Instead of a 1v1 combat, the characters were on a small arena all together, and their attacks weakened the opponent instead of damaging him until he flew off the screen. Character controls resembled more those of a platformer, double jumps, blocks, and usage of weapons you could find on the level. However, the whole platformlessness did not prevent you from flying outside the arena, so Super Smash Bros. Was used for beefs between players no less than fighting games. To put it brief, the N64 had almost every chance of being the best console of its generation. And I suppose that is exactly what would have happened if Sony hadn't been conquering the market by then, thanks to the affordability of their console and the great games you could launch on it. But regardless, both 3DO and Nintendo 64 left a deep mark in the industry's history and earned the love of the gamer community. Xbox owes its birth to Sony's loud statement made at the PS2 announcement. The Japanese lads not only told about their new console, but also positioned it as a direct competitor to personal computers. Microsoft couldn't have ignored such a provocation, as the only thing that is more famous than their console is their Windows operating system. Besides, the rivalry for the title of the main home entertainment device had been brewing for quite some time. As a result, the green light was given to a whole of 2 versions of the console. The first one had a platform of its own with its own architecture. This variant was promptly scrapped, making way to the second one, a specialized gaming computer based on Windows. Since the project was handled by DirectX development team, the prototype of their console was often called DirectX Box. As you have probably guessed, the name Xbox came from this very title. The development itself was quite tough. The team had to abandon the idea of computer running on Windows and return to the option of a standalone console, as computer components would have significantly increased the production cost. This decision led to countless scandals, because asking Bill Gates to choose something beside Windows is like making Henry Ford drive a Toyota. The project only stayed afloat because Sony still had to be fought, which meant that suspending the development wasn't an option. Another problem arrived in the form of the game that was positioned as the main exclusive of the future Xbox: Halo Combat Evolved. Microsoft had certain troubles negotiating with the studios. The Micros were trying to buy out studios to ensure exclusivity for their games. Thus, they came across Bungie, a company that was on the verge of bankruptcy at the time. Microsoft were openly mocked as console first-person shooters were perceived as a dead genre. On top of that, Halo looked poor on trade show demonstrations and lagged a lot. But not long before the release date, it unleashed its potential, and the audience's anger promptly switched not just to mercy, but to adoration. So, what was special about this best console shooter since GoldenEye? To begin with, the sheer scale of the events. The game's story was about a war between humanity and an alliance of alien races. Humans were barely holding on under the enemy's onslaught, and the last hope was put in the modified super soldiers called the Spartans. The aliens destroyed the planet where the soldiers were created, and only one spaceship successfully made its escape. We had to take the role of the last remaining Spartan named John 117, defend the ship, and lead the fight for humanity. Besides an epic story, Halo's gameplay was also pleasantly surprising. It was here that popular features of modern shooters first appeared, such as fighting both on foot and in vehicles, or the ability to carry only 2 weapons. The AI also added certain surprises, like believable firefights with the use of cover. On top of that, Halo took full advantage of Xbox hardware. The game stood out for both excellent graphics and great dynamics that was just as great even in multiplayer. The latter, by the way, was so popular that fans often had special parties when they would connect 4 consoles and TVs to the same network, thus allowing a total of 16 people to play together. In short, the bet placed on the console's main game turned out not to be just a success, but a jackpot. Of course, such a success would hardly have been possible if Microsoft hadn't been so lucky with the specialists who worked at Bungie. The studio gathered true professionals of their fields. Just take a look at Halo's combat system. It's scary to think how much work and sweat it took back in the day to write all these mechanics, and most importantly, make them work properly in the game. But back to the difficulties with finding developers. Microsoft had a hard time not only finding studios for exclusives, but also just releasing games on Xbox. To many, the console from Microsoft seemed like a failure at first, especially since the first presentations were structured solely around the potential commercial success of Xbox. Wouldn't you agree that when even such a well-respected company comes to your door and tells you about how they're gonna capture the market with their startup, it's pretty hard to approve of their idea without at least the slightest doubt. What made a better impression were the really outstanding technical specifics. The console was at least 2 times more powerful than PlayStation 2 in literally every aspect, which allowed it to support graphics that can be called decent even by today's standards. Just look at the very same Halo. Another feature was the built-in hard drive, which replaced memory cards. As the presentation strategy changed, so did the opinion on Microsoft's console. A perfect example of initially doubtful developer was Bethesda. At first, its director Todd Howard couldn't understand who would want a PC game on a console, but the presentation of technical specifications impressed him so much that in the end, The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind was ported to Xbox. I'm pretty sure that literally everyone has heard about this legendary first-person RPG, but not to go through it would be a sin. In Morrowind, we had to create our own character who belonged to one of the 10 races and possessed a number of stats. And then we were off to explore a province of a vast fantasy world. Like in any respectful protagonist, your character had to complete a series of quests and save the world from yet another threat. This time, it was a local divinity wishing to take over Morrowind. Of course, apart from the main plot, the game had numerous smaller stories that made the in-game world much more interesting and lively. Many fans praise the third part of the Elder Scrolls series to this very day for its amazing atmosphere. The icing on the cake was the remarkable soundtrack, for which I, for example, would load one of my city saves and do nothing. Just listen to the music. All of this made Morrowind insanely popular. Of course, the game is primarily associated with PCs, but its sales on Xbox were inferior only to those of Halo. Talking about multi-platformer games, it's impossible not to mention the continuation of the Need for Speed series titled Underground. The new NFS was still the same arcade racing sim about cool cars, but it was here where the franchise's signature style took form. Night City races, crazy car tuning, and of course, the soundtrack, popular to this day. Moreover, Underground had a story that didn't try to draw attention away from the actual races and nicely complemented the game. As for the Xbox version of Need for Speed, it was executed perfectly. Of course, its graphics were a bit worse than those of the PC version, but in comparison with PS2 and GameCube ports, the Xbox port looked much prettier while maintaining a stable frame rate. The game's sequel, reasonably titled Underground 2, also took full advantage of the console power, so the graphics became even better. But of course, it weren't just the visuals that have been improved in the sequel. The car fleet became larger and more diverse, just like the tuning, while the plot turned into a full-fledged story that unfolded along with your progress. Underground 2 could even surprise you with sudden events. For example, the player's character could be invited to photo shoots for various magazine and disc covers. I mean, yeah, you could be awarded with those after a race in the previous game as well, but here it was a separate event that you even had to drive to. It's hard to describe my emotions when a real car magazine with a sample of my exquisite designer taste on the cover was added to my gallery, and all of this was accessible in 2004 on a console, almost without FPS drops or downgrades in graphical effects. In a word, fantastic. Returning to the exclusives, a few words can be said about the racing opposite of NFS, Forza Motorsport. The differences from Underground were drastic. Instead of illegal street racing, virtual racers had to study official tracks, and freakish tuning gave way to meticulous and realistic car adjustments. Damage physics were also way more realistic, so you could no longer turn by simply huddling up against the track walls. But these differences did not make Forza worse than Need for Speed. Rather, it provided a different, and most importantly, equally fun experience. One of the main features of the game was an enormous car fleet, even by today's standards, containing a total of 231 cars. And of course, it's impossible not to praise the graphics, which even now don't seem outdated. As a result, Forza was warmly welcomed by players and was able to give birth to an entire series of car simulators with new parts being released even today. While searching for developers, Microsoft was lucky to acquire another studio, Rare. Known to us for Battletoads, for example, thanks to this, Xbox exclusively got the platformer Conker's Live and Reloaded, an improved version of the good old Conker's Bad Fur Day from Nintendo 64. The core gameplay and story remained the same, so I'll start with them. The game told us about the adventures of Conker the Squirrel, another example of the cartoon furry enough platformer genre, but unlike its peers, Conker deconstructed the genre by using adult humor. On one hand, the story was about usual cartoonish adventures, but on the other hand, it didn't hesitate to include vulgarity, strong language, alcohol, and other joys of PGI-18. Gameplay-wise, Conker was a typical 3D platformer where you had to run and jump your way through levels. The classic formula was diluted with numerous contextual actions that changed the gameplay depending on the situation. For example, in some areas it was necessary to throw objects and in the others to even shoot. As for the Xbox remake, it could boast two major improvements. The first one being, as you might have guessed, updated graphics. The entire Conker was completely redrawn, what made it look like a decent platformer of today. The second and more important update was the redesigned multiplayer from the original game. It contained several standard modes like Capture the Flag or Deathmatch, as well as different characters with their own classes, weapons, and abilities. To be frank, I'm not exactly sure who needed multiplayer for a game like this, but judging by the reviews, it was more than popular. More than that, Conker as a whole wasn't just popular, it was one of Xbox's best sellers.
You don't look much like hero material to me, but Maze knows what he's doing, I suppose.
Today's video wouldn't be complete without another memorable game, Fable, from the renowned video game fantasist Peter Molyneux. This action RPG can be called a truly authorial brainchild. which shows how badly Molyneux wanted to bring his incredible idea to life. To begin with, Fable offered us not just to play a particular story, but to live an entire life in a very cozy fantasy world. And I mean literally, we had to control the character starting from the very childhood and until his oldest years. Various interactions with the in-game world made the path of our protagonist extremely eventful. For example, you were able to communicate with in-game characters, have relationships, and face all the consequences. Go buck wild in local taverns, fish, change your appearance, buy a house and furnish it. In short, do anything that comes to mind. But that's not the end of it. All those activities change the protagonist. For example, fighting without armor left deep scars, wearing menacing robes with spikes and skulls intimidated those around you, and practicing magic accelerated the protagonist's aging. Naturally, such great and elaborate variability couldn't do without the role-playing and karma system, which also affected the character's appearance. And don't forget that all these metamorphoses occurred in the course of a fairy tale story. The character's home village was burned when he was a child, and his family was murdered. A sad beginning to say the least, but it provided excellent ground for character development, numerous important moral choices, and of course, a confrontation with the local evil. In addition to the main plot, Fable also had many side quests with stories of their own. Keep in mind that all of the above is intertwined, which gives us a truly believable world and a great opportunity to live in it. To sum up, I'd say that despite a rough start, Microsoft was able to both firmly establish itself in the market and give players a whole number of video game masterpieces. Of course, the first Xbox can be called a total success. For example, the console was poorly welcomed in Japan because of its distinctly American design, and in general, Microsoft didn't get too much profit from the sales. Last time, when we talked about SEGA, the company was in quite a sticky situation to say the least. A series of poor decisions resulted in SATURN not being able to successfully compete with the first PlayStation, even though it had every chance to do so. As always, I advise you to check out the previous video from our playlist for some context. SATURN's failure resulted in both financial losses and personnel reshuffles up to the replacement of SEGA's CEO. All of this naturally affected the company's reputation, and something had to be done about all these problems. The development of the new console began back in the times of SATURN. By the way, rumors about the new console also had a negative effect on SATURN's sales. As for the future of DREAMCAST, SEGA would not even been SEGA if everything went smoothly. Two versions of the console were being developed simultaneously, and one of them was cancelled because of 3DFX, the company responsible for the graphics chip. They and SEGA signed the contract, all details of which went public when 3DFX put its shares on the market. SEGA's management was furious, and the contract was terminated. As if there weren't enough problems, 3DFX took the matter to court, but at least this problem was settled peacefully. On the other hand, SEGA finally learned from its mistakes. As a result, they managed to make Dreamcast both relatively cheap and surprisingly performative for its time. A total of 8 MB of video memory with anti-aliasing and other graphical effects gave a picture so good that in some cases even PS2 games looked worse than their Dreamcast versions. The console allowed the use of up to 4 unusually shaped joysticks. The form was explained by the possibility to insert a device called VMU, Visual Memory Unit, into the joystick. It served as a memory card, a standalone mini console with simplistic games, and as an add-on to the joystick. For example, in Resident Evil, the VMU screen showed the character's health bar. It is worth noting that PS1 later also got a similar device called Pocket Station. However, on both consoles, it was more of a funny accessory rather than a necessary component. Another thing worth mentioning is the built-in modem, which allowed players to use a special browser, download more content, and of course, compete in multiplayer. Such technical specifications secured the Dreamcast a successful launch in Japan, even considering Sega's tarnished reputation. The new console caused quite a stir, and the announcement of a full-fledged 3D platformer about Sonic only added to it. Although, even here, Sega managed to make two mistakes at once. The first one was the undersupply of Dreamcasts to meet the demand at the sales launch. It is today that all PS5 are sold out and the whole world will patiently wait, but back then, a delay meant losing the market. So, Sega urgently set up mass production of the consoles, which entailed a significant drop in quality. Subsequently, burned drives and power units casted a huge cloud over Dreamcast's success. The second mistake was the delay of the new Sonic, along with the much anticipated Sega Rally Championship 2. The games were released just a couple of weeks after the console, but this reduced an already modest launch lineup to just 4 titles and, naturally, upset the fans. Nonetheless, when Sonic Adventure did come out, it turned out to be astonishingly good. To begin with, the game had 6 playable characters with different controls and abilities, including 2 new ones to the series. They all took part in the main story, but playing as one of them revealed a different part of the plot. Each character also had different versions of game levels with different gameplay, varied and at times even unique bosses, and when rivaling characters clashed, it was possible to fight either side. The story itself has also evolved significantly since the classic games of the series. Chaos Emeralds and Master Emerald, which previously acted only as sources of great energy and character superforms, turned out to be connected to a mighty ancient beast called Chaos.
You know nothing, fool! It's Chaos, the god of destruction!
Dr. Robotnik, who got his famous moniker Eggman, destroys the Master Emerald and unleashes chaos trapped within it. The story then focuses on the hero's search for the remaining emeralds, because if chaos absorbs them, it will become too powerful and extremely dangerous to the in-game world. And the world had plenty of space to run wild. The player could get to individual levels from one of the 3 impressive-sized locations: Station Square City, Mystic Ruins, and Egg Carrier, Dr. Eggman's ship. Each of these locations had secrets like character upgrades, and they were interesting to explore in general. The game world also featured the Chao Gardens, tiny creatures that were remotely reminiscent of the Tamagotchi pets. Their gameplay was also the same. The player had to grow and feed them. By the way, Dreamcast's VMU allowed you to take care of Chao even away from the console, which quite literally turned them into Tamagotchis. The progress, of course, could be transferred to the console. To be frank, this particular aspect of the game never appealed that much to me, but the numerous rave reviews are hard to ignore. As a whole, Sonic Adventure not only sold successfully, but is still considered by many fans to be the best game in the series. The only game that was able to repeat such success was the sequel, Sonic Adventure 2. It had visibly improved graphics, new characters, and the plot became even more ambitious and intertwined. The core, however, remained the same. Eggman finds a new mighty creature, which turns out to be a hedgehog named Shadow, and together they are collecting Chaos Emeralds to take over the world. Instead of 6 different characters, we were given 2 teams, heroes and villains. Thus, their mutual story could be viewed from both sides. There were no locations between the levels, and the gameplay variability was reduced, but everything became much more dynamic. The game no longer looked like a lengthy leisure adventure. Now it was more like a very dynamic action, even when you had to thoroughly explore the level in search of various items. Because of all this, the sequel left an ambiguous aftertaste. Of course, in many ways it inherited and developed the ideas of the original, but for the most part, Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 provided a different experience, and the debates about which part of the duology is better are relevant even today.
Oh, it's this great old TV show, and I was the star! See, now look at me. See, that's me!
This is weirding me out.
By the time Dreamcast was released in the US, the situation with the rather modest starting lineup had been fixed. It now offered 18 titles instead of 4. Moreover, the console's library received some truly great games. One of them was Soul Calibur, the sequel of Soul Edge fighting game which was released back on PS1. Since it was developed by Namco, the company we're all familiar with, the game can be best described as Tekken with weapons. For example, the gameplay was classic. Two characters in 2D perspective try to deplete each other's health bar, but using other things beside their bare hands. Combat-wise, it is worth noting the elaborated defensive technique which allowed to block hits, deflect them, and open the enemy for a blow, as well as the ability to move rather freely in all 8 directions on the arena. As any decent hit, Soul Calibur can be praised for outstanding graphics and animation for its time, wild dynamics, and captivating atmosphere. In short, a must-have, worth buying a Dreamcast. Another must-have was Shenmue, an open-world third-person action game. It seemed like this game was constantly displaying the capabilities of Dreamcast in every possible aspect. And no wonder, because Shenmue had a record-breaking budget of $70 million, what made it a great interactive movie. First and foremost, the game had mind-boggling life simulation. Just to remind you, it was 1999. In the evening, stores would close down. When it rained, people on the street would pull out their umbrellas or hide under some roof. You could chat with any NPC you meet. Of course, the game didn't exactly offer a great variety of topics for small talks, but even in many games of today, it's usually hard to find a talkative NPC. The player also could interact with the in-game world, just take the episodes with feeding a stray kitten. By the end of the first part, the protagonist was offered to take a picture and choose between 2 photos. In the second part, however, we got this episode when the protagonist recalls the events of the first part and shows the photo which the player had selected, as the game uses the save files. All these little things made Shenmue incredibly atmospheric. This was also helped by the graphics, maxed out to achieve the picture that was previously unattainable. As for the game's downsides, I would surprisingly name the very same atmosphere, because before you start the game, you have to understand that this is not an action game. The gameplay is smooth and meditative to the very routine. Yes, I'm talking about you boring ass fork truck. And it lacks truly wild moments. But as for the ability to relax and immerse yourself in a fascinating story, even today, Shenmue hardly knows any equals.
Stay with me for a while.
To take something more action-driven, let's say a few words about Jet Set Radio. It's a 3D action about roller skating gang wars. They fight for territory and reputation by leaving their graffiti. I bet you can already tell how cool this game wanted to be and how badly it wanted to appeal to the younger audience. Oddly enough, such cliches didn't spoil the game one bit. In fact, quite the opposite. Jet Set Radio is ridiculously good with its atmosphere. The acidic visual design and hilarious soundtrack only made it funnier. Speaking of graphics, this was the first game to implement cel shading, a technology that makes the game's graphics look hand-drawn. Thanks to cel shading, the whole environment looked a bit cartoonish and made it crystal clear that we're dealing with a game that couldn't be further from a dead serious title about gangster wars. That's what made the game so appealing, because having fun in a well-made goofy arcade is quite a rewarding experience.
Hey, come on over, have some fun with Crazy Taxi! Yeah!
Another Dreamcast hit, Crazy Taxi, had a similar effect. The title itself is a clear enough representation of what the game is all about. In this simulator, the player had to drive clients from point A to point B while performing stunts and making total mayhem on the road. And unlike in real life, the client won't complain about your stunts, but will instead reward you with generous tips. There was no story, the physics could be described as crazy at best, and graphics-wise, there was nothing outstanding, but the game didn't need all of that. Just like the previous game in our list, Crazy Taxi was more about arcade and fun without a hint of realism, so it was warmly welcomed for similar reasons. Besides, the initially low difficulty eventually forced you to dive into the intricacies of stunt performing, which only added to the immersion into the road madness. So the main thing I would point out about Dreamcast's greatest hits would be that they all were atmospheric and captivating. Taking into account the work that has been done to improve the console's architecture and restore Sega's reputation, the first console of the new 6th generation had every chance to claim its place on the market. Unfortunately, there was no miracle for two simple reasons. The first one is called PS1, which became everyone's favorite and was still a relevant platform. The second one ironically turned out to be PS2, with the release of which Sega's plans to once again get a foothold in the console wars became well and truly doomed. And although the company's management was now making less marketing mistakes, they were still making them. Eventually, Sega decided to switch to developing titles for all platforms, which made it the company we know today. Oddly enough, the development of the second PlayStation began with an impasse of sorts. After the success of the PS1, the developers from Sony had no idea how to make their second console just as successful. This was due to the fact that not only did they have to attract a new audience and keep the old one, but also to move on to a new generation of gaming systems. Sony had not yet faced such a challenge, which affected the nature of their future presentations. Even before PS2 was shown to the world, the developers were trying to surprise journalists by the graphical technologies that were planned to be used in the games. To this end, special demo videos were created. Their goal was to say, look, here's what to expect. Thanks to this, Sony was able to raise the hype without showing any new titles or even the look of the console. Fortunately, those expectations were met. As we know from the last video, PS2 was even more performative than the Dreamcast. The processor bitrate, the frequency were higher, and in addition, there was an extremely powerful vector processor. Plus, PS2 had twice as much random access memory, 32 megabytes against 16. But the Dreamcast had more video random access memory, 8 megabytes against 4, which is why in certain PlayStation ports, for example, the textures are more blurry when comparing to the Dreamcast. Although the Dreamcast hardly won anything from it, and if you somehow missed the details, I invite you to have a gander at our previous video about consoles. Sony got tangled in its own promises, which is why the launch lineup of games looked big, yet hardly sparked any interest even in the US, let alone Japan. To make matters worse, the first PlayStation was still quite popular and was even receiving hits like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. At this point, the developers saved themselves by making two decisions. The first one was to make PS1 discs fully compatible with the new console. This alleviated the situation a bit, because the old library wasn't going anywhere, and even the release of new games didn't mean any competition between Sony's consoles. By the way, because of this, almost everything I told you about the first PlayStation in the corresponding video is still relevant here, so I advise you to watch it if you haven't already. The second decision was a bit weirder, to promote the PS2 as a DVD player. Of course, game advertising and game marketing was still a #1 priority, but the opportunity to watch your favorite movie on a device that costs significantly less than your usual DVD player was a surprisingly strong argument. However, even that wasn't the oddest thing the PS2 marketing gave birth to. In order to stand out against Nintendo products, the console was positioned as an entertainment device for adult and respectable gamers. This resulted in a series of rather weird commercials. For example, one of them showed a very bizarre looking girl reflecting on the intellectual enrichment of mankind. Interesting thoughts, but what did they have to do with the console is unclear. Another video showed Sony's final gaming system, the PlayStation 9. The idea was great, as it implied that the PS2 is just a step towards the bright virtual future. However, the PS2 itself wasn't even mentioned in the video, when it definitely should have been, in my humble opinion. The peak of advertising madness was achieved by the video called The Third Place, shot by the legend himself, David Lynch. In it, some guy was making his way through a dark corridor full of traps and graphical effects. At the end of the corridor, he encountered his own clone, a mummy and a duck wearing a suit, who said,
"Welcome to the third place."
If you were left wondering what the hell was that after watching it, you were not the only one. But let's leave the analysis of these peculiar videos to the experts and move on to the games. All the more since the second PlayStation has hits for any taste. I'll start with one of the console's top exclusives, Shadow of the Colossus. It's a third-person adventure where we, as a warrior named Wander, set out to hunt down 16 giant colossi. The motivation behind such an adventure was, of course, the need to save the protagonist's loved one. The plot didn't offer anything special, but the gameplay at the time was quite surprising. First of all, the player was not forced to follow a predetermined storyline. You're free to go anywhere you want and chase any colossus after the first temple fight. By the way, you had to search for them for yourself in the vast in-game world. Then, you had to figure out each giant's vulnerabilities and the most suitable style of combat, all while memorizing their attack patterns. Naturally, at the start the protagonist was given a sword, a bow with arrows, and a trusty steed. But compared to half-hour tutorials of some other games, Shadow of the Colossus gave you a feeling of freedom. Combined with a stunning visual style and intriguing storyline, it was such a unique adventure that before the re-releases, people would purchase a PS2 just for this game. But let's suppose that you'd like to try something a bit more straight, but equally groundbreaking. In that case, you should try Resident Evil 4, another installment of the famous series that redefined good old survivor horror. First of all, it brought the familiar over-the-shoulder perspective to 3D shooters. Firstly, it made the protagonist much more agile and therefore reduced the degree of danger. And secondly, after beating the classic parts of the series, this game was astonishingly comfortable to play. And despite the reduced amount of spookiness, Resident Evil 4 was still a B-horror movie. They even added an enemy with a chainsaw. The story was fitting. Leon Kennedy, whom we know from the second part, arrives at a Spanish village in search of the president's daughter, but finds the local equivalent of zombies, a religious cult, a castle with its insane owner, and a military base, and God knows what else. It's worth mentioning that despite the upgrade of the gameplay, it still wasn't that dynamic. And those players who craved for that kind of serious and absurd atmosphere but would like more action were out to try Devil May Cry. By the way, the series was born from an early version of Resident Evil 4, which is very noticeable in the first Devil May Cry game. The second one turned out to be rather unsuccessful and is not usually mentioned in fine company. But Devil May Cry 3 turned out to be the series recipe on the second PlayStation. I would recommend starting your acquaintance with the adventures of the demon hunter Dante with this game. Plus, the franchise's storyline begins in the third part. In it, young Dante barely opens his office when he receives a not-so-friendly message from his twin brother. Then, a bunch of demons appear and tear the office down, forcing our protagonist to go to a family reunion.
This party's getting crazy. Let's rock.
Devil May Cry is still famous for its insane combat system, but it was in this game where it achieved its full potential. You could slice your enemies in close combat with one set of weapons and shoot them from a distance with another. And with the help of jumps, rolls, and the ability to hold your opponent in the air, the player was able to perform extremely stylish combos. Later in story, Dante was also given the ability to use the demonic form to deprive the opponents of the slightest chance to win. But don't think that DMC was all about fun and games. The possibility to die on a single boss some 10 times in a row forced you to dive into the intricacies of demon slaying to be able to perform spectacular moves and squeeze the ever-living shit from the style meter. Okay, you may say, but is there something more fairy tale-y and fantasy-like? In that case, the Kingdom Hearts series is worth taking a look. It's a colorful action RPG with one of the most non-obvious concepts imaginable. I mean, seriously, who would have thought that a crossover between Final Fantasy and Disney animated movies will become so popular? Here, we have a dynamic game full of epic melee fights, and all of it takes place in locations we're familiar with since childhood. The gameplay is so captivating that it doesn't really matter how strange it is to watch a dead serious scene of anime guys talking to Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse. Kingdom Hearts has an enormous and intertwined story, the essence of which boils down to the following. There is a universe that unites different worlds. Most of these worlds are Disney ones. Every creature has some sort of heart and essence that makes it possible to feel emotions. It can be lost, which splits the creature into a husk called Nobody, and the heart itself, which turns into a Heartless. It is possible to defeat a Heartless with a special key-shaped blade, in which case both entities will die and the creature's heart will go to the Kingdom Hearts. Local villains strive to conquer this realm to obtain infinite power, while the heroes try to protect it. So this isn't just an opportunity to fight Cerberus from Hercules. Or take Okami for example, an equally fascinating game that uses the fantasy of ancient Japanese legends rather than classic fairy tales. It's an action-adventure about the sun goddess with a peculiar name, Amaterasu, who has taken the form of a wolf and is fighting the powerful demon named Orochi. The story is based on Japanese mythology and has many references to it. By the way, for those who would like to get acquainted with this worthy game, I hasten to warn you about tons of dialogues. For the most part, they are quite interesting, but at times there's simply too much of them, and the ability to skip dialogues was only added in the HD re-release of Okami. The game's graphics continues with the development of Japanese culture and philosophy. The cel shading technology makes everything look like traditional ink and paint art styles. And it's not just for fun. The main gameplay gimmick is the sky brush, which allowed you to pause the game and draw all kinds of various objects. For instance, the player could slice enemies by crossing them out, draw a bridge to cross a river, or even depict the sun in the sky, which then indeed appeared in the game. Naturally, this was the basis for quests and puzzles, almost like in Comic Zone, but instead of the villain, it's now you who finishes everything. Thanks to such unique features, Okami has passed the test of time with flying colors, and even now, it will be quite interesting to play.
The gods of Olympus have abandoned me.
When you start to grow tired of all these Japanese anime stuff, you can launch God of War, another great exclusive of the era till the next gen re-releases. Unlike the stylish and refined heroes of the previous games, here we took on the role of Kratos, a brutal Spartan warrior and soon to become the God of War. Gameplay wise, the game was like a slasher, reminiscent of DMC, but to fit the main character, the combat and the story were more serious, brutal, and gory. Of course, on his path, Kratos had to face numerous enemies and puzzles inherent to the genre. Going back to the topic of positioning the PS2, this was a perfect example of how Sony tried to target the adult audience. And unlike questionable commercials, this step towards more mature players turned out to be much more effective. The reinterpretation of Greek mythology and face-melting action entailed not only the success of the first God of War, but a whole franchise which is relevant to this day. Nowadays, every protagonist is a Leon, annihilating packs of zombies one after another. To take something more down to earth and realistic, on the second PlayStation, you can't go past the sequels of Metal Gear Solid. And as much as I personally love the second installment, for the most part, it took the original MGS and multiplied it by 2 in each and every aspect. It's more interesting to talk about Metal Gear Solid 3, which brought significant changes to the series' gameplay. Here, we have another third party in a franchise, which actually acts as the first in the series. Consequently, we were playing not as Solid Snake, but as his father, Naked Snake, later known in the MGS's lore as Big Boss. Various cool gadgets also haven't been brought in yet, so we have to do some honest stealth with cover and camouflage. The game's story was unfolding in the forests of Siberia. The question of what are crocodiles doing in Siberia is left unanswered. The main thing for which the third MGS was and is still appreciated is the fact that it mocks spy action movies of the 80s and lets us plunge into its atmosphere all at the same time. The familiar variability of task solving was pleasing. You could act stealthy like Hitman or Sam Fisher, or be up for a gunfight like James Bond. To sum up, just like in 1996, we were once again plunged into a terrific game film which simply couldn't let you go. Practically any of our videos include some cool racing game. Now is the right time to talk about Gran Turismo, especially since the awesome fourth part of this series was released exclusively for PS2. To begin with, the game had two main modes. The first one was a standard arcade mode, where you could simply have fun racing around, enjoy truly beautiful cars and tracks, and appreciate the realistic physics. Now, of course, it no longer seems so flawless, but in comparison with arcade Need for Speeds of the time, this game was much more closer to the real driving simulators. The second mode of the game was called Gran Turismo, and it immersed us in the career of a racing car driver. As in any racing game, here we were participating in various races to win money and use it to upgrade old cars and buy new ones. But the classic gameplay was complemented by some interesting details. For example, to advance the career, the racers needed licenses of different levels. To get them, you essentially had to pass a driving test by performing tough turns, accelerate and slow down at the right time, and so on. Apart from racing licenses, the game had full-blown racing missions where you had to accomplish a certain objective in certain conditions. For example, you're in an old pickup in Los Angeles in the rush hour and have to reach the state's border in under 30 minutes. Otherwise, you'll get fired. Well, I mean, the missions weren't that hardcore, but you get the idea. And then there were all sorts of professional leagues, rallies, enormous races to test your endurance, and so on. All in all, Gran Turismo portrayed motorsport in all its glory. And sometimes you want to do a little bit of everything. To drive around, to shoot some guns, to follow the story, or to just do silly stuff in the in-game world. Perhaps there is no better place to do all of the above than in the Grand Theft Auto series. The franchise's precipice at the time, released for PS2, was San Andreas, the fifth game in the series. If you count the two-dimensional parts, the game could have been called a life simulator if your life was filled with street gang wars. I'm sure that the story of San Andreas is known to everyone, but just in case, allow me to remind you. The game's protagonist, Carl Johnson, better known as CJ, receives the news of his mother's death and returns to his hometown.
Oh shit, here we go again.
CJ finds his ghetto on the decline, after which the long and arduous path to success for both our hero and his street gang begins. The gameplay is actually a bit hard to describe. On one hand, it's a simple run, shoot and drive. On the other hand, a rather big imaginary state of San Andreas had ton of activities to offer, ranging from gyms, clothing shops and hair salons to opportunities to bet on horses, rob houses, or vice versa, catch criminals with your own hands. Although most often we would just enter a weapon cheat code and have a war with in-game cops. The amounts of content can be seen even in the numerous Easter eggs. A huge constellation of stars in the night sky that copies Rockstar logo is the tip of the Easter egg iceberg. And if San Andreas in all its variety somehow managed to get boring, the PS2 version, as well as the Xbox version by the way, could offer multiplayer. It wasn't exactly convenient because both characters had to stay on the screen, but who cares if you could play GTA together. It ended up officially being the best-selling game on the PlayStation 2, and rightly so, in my opinion. Let's end today's video by saying a few words about mascots that simply must be mentioned in order for the video to be considered complete. Crash Bandicoot, after his success on the PS1, was now migrating from one developer to another, and although its sequels were of quite a decent quality, it's hard to call him the mascot of the second PlayStation. Ratchet & Clank, a series of games that was first released for PS2 and is still relevant today, is more likely to take that role. The third installment, titled Up Your Arsenal, was the one and judging by the reviews, many other fans remember the most. It was a third-party person action with shooter elements, so we had to run, jump, and do some not so realistic but extremely fun shooting. The protagonist's name is Ratchet, who is a member of the Lombax race, which resembles small animals. Sometimes we had to play as his companion, Clank the robot. Throughout many games in the series, this duo opposed the evil Dr. Nefarious, the leader of the equally evil Tyrannoid race. The third Ratchet, in keeping with the best traditions of the series, stood out for its appealing visual style, reminiscent of space fiction cartoons. In such an atmosphere, it was quite pleasant to explore levels filled not only with enemies, but also with secrets like hidden locations. As in the GTA, here we were also offered the multiplayer mode, which first appeared in the third installment. It had the classic modes of the time, deathmatch, siege and capture the flag, which was not exactly impressive even then. However, the gameplay and controls were done well enough that multiplayer fights felt quite good as they were. That's why I remember Ratchet & Clank as both another great game to beat and a good place for multiplayer brawls. To sum it all up, even in such a lengthy video, I was unable to cover all the worthy masterpieces for the PlayStation 2. But even without that, it is clear that the main advantage of the console was a terrific game library, where you can find great games for any taste. So for me personally, there is nothing surprising about the extreme popularity of the PS2 and its leadership in the 6th generation of consoles. Okay, from the top, these are personal computers we're talking about, and we've been using them for playing games longer than any console. The first computers appeared back in the 50s, but those were heavy machines, not exactly suitable for gaming. However, that didn't stop enthusiasts in 1961 from making the first computer game called Space War. Then computers moved into households thanks to the efforts of Apple. Later, there were computers from IBM that used Intel architecture, and then came 1993 that brought us
the Intel Pentium processor.
Popularization of computer games began a bit earlier, for which we have to thank the guys from ID Software. But in general, it'll be safe to say that PC gaming as we know it appeared somewhere in the early 90s. And since I've just mentioned ID Software, it would be unfair not to start today's video with the legendary Doom. Born in distant 1993, this shooter has left such a great mark on the industry that I can hardly add anything to everything that has already been said about it. Doom brought us multiplayer battles, first speedruns, and of course, countless hours of demon slaying. The game's popularity allowed it to receive an unfathomable number of ports, so if you'd like to make an acquaintance with this chapter of the game dev industry, you'll be able to do so regardless of the platform that you're using, let it be a printer or an ATM. Those who remember the dawn of the first Doom should also remember that before Doom, ID Software was developing Wolfenstein 3D, the basis of which helped in the making of the Martian Demon Slayer. The game told the story of an American scout who got imprisoned in the Nazi castle Wolfenstein, then decided to escape and defeat Hitler on his way out. The game didn't spark such a hysteria as Doom. After all, it is only a predecessor, but this was not because of the game's poor quality. ID Software were simply making their first steps.
Good morning and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System. This automated train is provided for the security and convenience of the Black Mesa Research Facility personnel.
Continuing with the topic of legendary shooters, it is worth mentioning Half-Life. I'm sure that almost all of our viewers are familiar with the adventures of Gordon Freeman, the silent physicist. The game's success was ensured by a fairly captivating story which was developing throughout the whole game, not just in the manual, and the gameplay that was more than just run and gun, and actually made you turn on your brain. The sequel, naturally, went even further and amplified strong suits of the original game. After Half-Life, there was much less desire to play storyless shooters. Unless, of course, they had multiplayer. And Half-Life had it as well, however, much more often we would play one particular Half-Life mod called Counter-Strike. Back in the day, as well as now, we would divide into terrorists and counter-terrorists and then fight to accomplish the map's objective. The game became insanely popular thanks to its distribution in internet cafes. Its peers were Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament. We'll get them next time. However, when juxtaposed to these games' plasma guns and monsters, Counter-Strike stood out for its realistic action. After all, shooting pistols and AKs was more comfortable, I guess. These games really put in demand shooters of all kinds. For example, they gave birth to the Battlefield franchise. Many fell in love with the series since the very first game that was called Battlefield 1942. The gameplay consisted of capturing control points on the battlefield, hence the title. These points allowed players to respawn and provided them various sorts of military machinery. Both teams also had a number of soldiers, which was spent when respawning and diminished if the team had fewer points under control than the enemy team. Losing all the soldiers meant a defeat. This provided a great field for tactical decisions, and the battles gained unprecedented epicness and immensity. This was complemented by a great soundtrack, where the main theme was a thing of its own. It's worth mentioning that this wasn't the first World War II shooter, but Battlefield 1942 had certainly pushed the genre forward. For example, it gave birth to the famous Call of Duty franchise, which is also worth talking about, but the time is limited and there are way too many videos about this series already, so there's no need to plow the sands. There were so many shooters that it would take hours to list them all. Just to name a few: Medal of Honor, which appeared on PCs since Allied Assault and gave us some of the most unusual missions of the time. Serious Sam, the First Encounter, where we would eliminate hordes of aliens and then have nightmares about the bomb kamikaze screams. The first Far Cry, which had so much content and such a vast in-game world that it was distributed on as much as 4 discs. And of course, the legendary Stalker, the shooter about the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. Unusual story, realistic AI, and unique ambience made this game truly one of a kind. We'll get back to the shooters, but for now, let's switch to another gaming genre: strategies. Here, there were also plenty of games to choose from, and we might as well start from another creation from the developers of Stalker, the Cossack series. Somehow it managed to combine somewhat arcade gameplay and very believable recreations of the 17th century battles. It also boasted a large number of nations with their own special troops. For example, I often played as Poland because of their really sick looking winged hussars. Then there was Total War, which on one hand was quite similar to Cossacks, yet it couldn't be more different. Unlike Cossacks, it felt much more tactical and turn-based. Here, you had to keep track of your troops, strengths and weaknesses, and take advantage of various military tricks like flanking your enemy or capturing high grounds. Each game of this series told the story of a different era, which put it one line with Cossacks. Yet Total War's approach was more historical. And since we're talking about TBS strategies, it would be a crime not to mention Heroes of Might and Magic. Players like me used to play the first and the second parts of the series. Those who were younger played the 5th part, but most often the phrase "Let's play Heroes" would mean the 3rd part of the franchise. It stood out for great graphics, a wide variety of races, characters, artifacts, etc. And the majestic soundtrack, of course. In terms of gameplay complexity, the third Heroes were somewhat between the previous 2 games of the series. Everything was quick and fun, yet with a grain of tactical thought you could turn the tables with one witty move. A built-in map generator and the ability to play together on one computer made for insane replayability. Because of this, dozens and hundreds of hours were spent in matches that we will certainly finish later. But most of the time, we'd play real-time strategies. For example, Command & Conquer, the first game of this series, became the founding father of the genre by developing the ideas that first appeared in the good old Dune 2. Here we have even more asymmetrical sides of the conflict, and the classic economy model for the later RTS games, where a soldier costs almost as much as the building that produces him, while the campaigns present the story through different missions. By the way, one of the series' advantages were the live-action clips used in these campaigns. It's fair to say that these very clips made CNC seem so epic and funny at the same time. Yet, a special niche in the genre has always been occupied by the ideological rivals of Command & Conquer, the strategies from Blizzard. The first one was called Warcraft, Orcs and Humans. Like CNC, it was largely based on the gameplay of Dune 2 and was a fantasy RTS about a war between humans and orcs, obviously. The second game in the series was essentially the first part, but much better, which secured a good reputation both for Blizzard and the franchise. Notably, the graphics became much more detailed, the missions much more interesting and diverse, and the developers also added a map editor and much more convenient multiplayer. But the real banger was Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos, later complemented by an equally famous add-on, the Frozen Throne. The strategy was now in full 3D, it had 4 different races instead of 2, and most importantly, they added new heroes, who were previously just upgraded versions of the ordinary characters and could only be accessible in campaigns. Now, a hero was an important and powerful addition to the army. Moreover, a hero possessed certain RPG elements like leveling and the ability to carry items. Another honorable mention is the map editor, which allowed you to make any game on the base of Warcraft, let it be Tetris or some shooter. By the way, the first Dota owes its birth to this editor, where we would play before it all became a standalone game from Valve. And then Warcraft evolved into an MMO RPG, known worldwide as World of Warcraft. Now, we were no longer managing large units, instead, the player had to upgrade his own character. To this end, he had to beat numerous quests, dungeons, and bosses. The game retained the atmosphere of the original title and went on with its plot, so here you could find literally all the locations and characters from the original strategy. WoW is still quite relevant today, so it's not too late to join the exploration of the world of Azeroth. But I must warn you that the good old World of Warcraft about the Wrath of the Lich King and the today's one about the Journey to Shadowlands are basically 2 different games. It's hard to say which one is better, because everything is getting improved and upgraded, but the first add-ons were still more interesting to play. We'll be talking about it in one of the upcoming videos, so stay tuned. Although, to be fair, even in its current state, World of Warcraft is still capable of keeping you engaged for a solid 100 hours. Speaking of equally addictive games, I can only think of Lineage 2, which, crudely put, had similar gameplay, only with an emphasis on leveling up, rather than on the exploration of the world and its history. Both games also had a PvP mode. In Warcraft, it was more of a duel mode, while in Lineage, a wall-to-wall battle could include up to 500 players, a working way to get in the shoes of a unit from StarCraft.
Hey, you listening to me? Hold on, I got visual.
Speaking of StarCraft, it was an RTS as well, but space-themed. The game was based on the same second Warcraft with enhanced tactical options. The developers managed to implement a completely asymmetric balance here. Instead of 2 races, they made 3 unique ones by using the concept from Dune 2 and CNC. The balance turned out to be so great that even today's second StarCraft still counts as an esports discipline. The story campaign was pleasantly surprising, with a whole bunch of cutscenes, briefings before missions, and clips between them. I was particularly impressed with the first StarCraft, because, after all, it was my first PC game. To be honest, even today, I still don't mind playing story campaigns from time to time, especially with the release of a great remaster. Of course, the game had some minor glitches, like the units struggling to find their way from time to time, but the rest of StarCraft was worth turning a blind eye to. Since we're talking about Blizzard, it's worth mentioning Diablo. It was an action RPG about how one of the three heroes would descend into deep dungeons to exterminate the demons, all while doing simple quests and occasionally returning to the surface to hand over tons of loot to the merchant. The game wasn't very dynamic, but even then it offered a very satisfying feeling of fighting numerous enemies. In keeping with the best traditions of the old Blizzard, the sequel made Diablo's strong suits even stronger and fixed its weaknesses. Thanks to that, we got an even more dynamic gameplay, a greatly increased number of weapons and enemies, and most importantly, a variety of locations instead of one big dungeon. Here, we had to explore forests, deserts, and temples of all shapes and sizes. And of course, it's impossible to convey this cascade of emotion that the player felt when entering the depths of hell, where he had to defeat Diablo himself. Speaking of RPGs, I definitely have to mention Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. It's the most popular part of the respective vampire game series. Here's the synopsis. Besides humans, there are also vampire clans in our world. They founded an organization called the Camarilla, which is some sort of a secret government. At the start of the game, we found ourselves in Los Angeles in early 2000s, when the protagonist gets turned into a vampire without the Camarilla's permission. The vampire responsible for this crime was executed, while we began the long and arduous path to become a part of the new society. Bloodlines had much more hardcore role-playing system than other games of the genre at the time. As usual, you could level up your character, but in order to gain experience, you had to perform specific actions instead of killing everything on your path. The actions included discovering secret areas, reading books, and completing quests. Completing these quests using stealth or pacifist tactics brought you more experience. What made the game tougher was the necessity to choose one of 7 clans when creating your character, as it would heavily influence the gameplay. For example, vampires from the Nosferatu clan weren't exactly the prettiest, so they had to either choose stealth or scare the in-game characters, while the Malkavian clan constantly had to deal with mental issues, which would result in the protagonist having a conversation with a road sign, for example. Speaking of conversations, the in-game characters were vibrant as hell, and this can be said about both their lines and awesome voice acting. The game also stood out for its story that consisted of truly great quests and multiple endings, excellent graphics for the time, and a soundtrack that popularized a whole number of rock songs. In short, it was such a great game that I am very much looking forward to the already announced second part.
The kingdom of Murtana, united by King Robar II.
There was also a no less interesting action RPG called Gothic. We used to play the first and the second parts of the series for hours on end. They told the story of a nameless hero who in the first game ended up in prison and was trying to get past the magical barrier that surrounded the prison mines, while in the sequel he was dealing with the aftermath of killing the demon who brought down the barrier. Gameplay and progression was more down to earth than in Bloodlines. Complete quests and kill monsters to gain experience and levels. But in return, Gothic would surprise you with unusual little things. Like most games on today's list, Gothic was loved for its interesting story, well-worked in-game world, and great soundtrack. But there were also some surprising features, such as the way of obtaining various loot. The first game began with our protagonist getting knocked down and stripped to the shirt, but with the help of certain skills, we ourselves could do the same thing to other characters. Another peculiarity was the controls. Almost all interactions with the world were done through the active action button, control on the default layout, and the direction of the movement. Need to pick up an item? Control up. Throw it out of the inventory? Control down. Need to talk to someone? Control up. By using the same combination, you could use magic, fight, parry, shoot, and much more. But on the other hand, such controls allowed to implement a decent fencing system, thanks to which the player could actually defeat strong enemies with early weapons and a grain of skill. And of course, everyone who played Gothic knows that the game is actually about parkour on rocks and cliffs. And those who haven't played it yet, better partake the classic. But let's take our minds off of all this role-playing stuff and talk about something more arcade-ish. The first thing that comes to mind is Carmageddon, a tabletop manual for a misanthropic car enthusiast. A truly unique thing, especially by current gaming standards. Remember those moments when you would drive around in GTA and accidentally hit a pedestrian and thought, oh my, how rude and embarrassing, but still a bit fun? Well, Carmageddon took this idea to a whole new level. Colorful animations of pedestrians flying around, bonuses for making the most spectacular and stupid mayhem, and the dark humor that accompanied it all. Oh, I almost forgot. It was also a racing game, and your objective was to be the first to cross the finish line. The car park was as you'd expect, so instead of slick sports cars, you had to drive absolutely insane vehicles covered with blades, spikes, jaw-shaped bumpers, etc. You could even drive an armored bulldozer if you felt like it. Needless to say, thanks to all this, Carmageddon was banned in many countries, and needless to say, it only fueled our interest in the game. A very different kind of simulator was The Sims, which allowed you to play God over one of more personal virtual humans. Simply put, it was a heavily upgraded version of the Tamagotchi. The virtual human called Sim would do all sorts of ordinary activities, live in a house, work, eat, sleep, watch TV, and we helped him lead a long and happy life. Or maybe not. Everyone remembers the pool thing, right? Okay, never mind. Each game in the series provided more ways to make the life of your sim happier and more vibrant. And I'll go back to shooters, because there are still a lot of titles to cover. Take Alien Shooter for example. I'm sure many of us have played the first and second parts of the series. It felt like a mixture of Doom and Diablo, allowing you to eliminate hordes of hostile fauna without having to deal with complicated mechanics. However, when you did want to deal with such mechanics, you could launch Hitman, a great stealth shooter that is popular even today. This game taught us that the killer profession is insanely difficult, because each victim of the Silent 47, the game's protagonist, required a unique approach. Somewhere you had to ambush the victim when it was alone. Somewhere you had to go under guise and wait for the right moment. Or you could perform an action to distract the guards, and all that could be on one single level.
They were all dead. The final gunshot was an exclamation mark to everything that had led to this point. I released my finger from the trigger, and then it was over.
Another memorable title was Max Payne, a shooter that took a lot from the movie genre, film noir. It fascinated the player with its visuals, cinematography, and of course, its heartfelt story. The game told us about Max Payne, a police officer whose family was killed by a gang of junkies. In order to bring them down and avenge his family, Max joins the DEA and is forced to work undercover. But because of that, his best friend gets murdered right in front of him, and Max becomes the prime suspect. In an attempt to exonerate himself, Payne carries on with his own investigation, and the story starts to take such turns that I strongly recommend you to go play the game yourself, because it's really worth it. The gameplay was hard to match the story. Technically, we had an ordinary corridor shooter, but the setting and the gameplay challenges didn't allow the player to get bored, and everything was diluted with the famous feature called bullet time, which essentially slowed down time. It allowed the player not only to contemplate passing bullets and snowflakes, but also to dodge enemies' bullets, all while sending them lead sandwiches. The graphics only complemented the action, as it was made using photographs of real objects, which were then turned into textures. The second game of the series possessed the same level of staging and elaboration. I'd even praise the third part, despite its questionable decisions.
What the?
You have a message from Mr. Salieri.
What the hell's going on?
Oh, no.
Well, that certainly changes the situation, gentlemen. Kill that clown!
The famous Mafia, the city of lost heaven, made a similar impression. The story of Tommy Angelo, who unexpectedly starts the career of a mobster, captivates you and doesn't let go, which makes it truly believable. But unlike Bane, it had the charming atmosphere of 1930s America with beautiful music and odd-looking retro cars. No less thrilling was the Fear horror shooter. The game immersed the player into the daily life of the first encounter assault recon unit, tasked with tackling supernatural threats. One of these threats turned out to be an army of clone soldiers which got out of control in a research lab. When the Fear squad arrived on the scene, the protagonist, one of the squad's operatives, started experiencing hallucinations and visions, and most importantly, he started seeing the ghost of a girl whose appearance was a reference to the antagonist from the Ring movie. For its time, the game had some very impressive technology. First of all, of course, the visual effects. All the hallucinations and apparitions looked more than convincing, thanks to which Fear kept the tension no worse than Silent Hill. The game's AI was also astounding, as it not only possessed most of the player's abilities, but also actively opposed him. Enemies took advantage of cover, communicated and cooperated with each other, ambushed the player. Long story short, the only thing that could save the protagonist was his special ability. In game it was called superhuman reflexes, but in fact it just slowed time. Like in Max Payne, only here it was first person. I admit that I missed this game when it was released and got to it just recently, but even now, it doesn't give the impression of something outdated or primitive, so I can surely recommend it. Since we started today's video with Doom, it will only be fair to end it with Crysis. Just like John Carmack's creation, Crysis heavily influenced the FPS genre and in some ways the embodiment of the gaming industry of its time. The plot was rather simple. A race of evil aliens had been dormant on the Philippine Islands since the Ice Age. These islands are captured by Korean troops, and the unit of the US Special Forces is dispatched to deal with the situation. We played as a member of the squad with the call sign Nomad, who possessed a futuristic nanosuit. The suit had a reserve of energy, which was spent on one of 4 modes: Armor, which provided strong protection; Strength, which allowed to jump high and deal more damage in melee combat; Speed and Cloak, which are pretty self-explanatory. These abilities allowed to successfully oppose Korean invaders as well as the awakened aliens. When comparing Crysis to its predecessors, there are 2 points worth noting. Firstly, the action here felt much more linear and intense. It can be compared to a roller coaster, where you have tons of fun riding one path, while earlier you had to wander around large maps and explore the surroundings. I won't say that it is for better or for worse, but it certainly felt new. And secondly, Crysis showed us a whole new level of graphics. Everything was made so technologically advanced that at the time of the game's release, there hardly was a PC that could meet its system requirements. But when the components and their price tags finally allowed us to try out this new pioneer in the industry, many players, including myself, were speechless. So that concludes our short tour of what we used to play on our PCs. Of course, there are way more worthy and memorable titles that I managed to cover even in such a hectic video. And I didn't even mention the PC piracy, which, just like on PS1, had so much going on that perhaps we should make a separate video about it. Thanks to the original Xbox, which didn't reach for the stars but was quite solid, Microsoft was able to get a foothold on the markets firm enough for the company to start talking about a new console. It was a decisive step, by making which the company was telling that the previous success wasn't a mere coincidence. So the developers decided to do some serious gap analysis regarding their first project. Thus, the name for the upcoming console was born. Instead of the obvious Xbox 2 or the funny Nextbox, Microsoft claimed that the new console differed from its predecessor so much that its entire design made a 360 turn. It's worth noting that with such approach, Microsoft were very lucky to nail it with the new Xbox, because 360 degrees is, a circle, like, it doesn't get you anywhere. Never mind. Instead, it's better to pay attention to the changes made by the developers. The differences were striking at the very first glance. Instead of a bulky box, which was the original Xbox, 360 had a sleek white design, while its joystick was no longer resembling a miniature spaceship and became one of the best and most handy ones on the market. Now, on one hand, in terms of the hardware, the console also received a significant upgrade. There was a funny story during the development, by the way. My fellow content makers have already told it in all the details, so I'll just say a few words. Microsoft couldn't find a decent partner to work on the processor, and after all the rejections, they turned to IBM, who were already engaged in similar work for PS3, together with the engineers from Sony. At the time, IBM already had the patent for their technology, but were pissed with Sony's attempts to take it away. Because of that, IBM had nothing against sharing the patent with both sides, which was a jackpot for Microsoft. Not only did the company legally get the work of their direct competitors, but also took, as it turned out, a very wise decision not to use the sophisticated architecture of the PS3 and make everything easier and, as a result, more accessible to game developers. On the other hand, the 360 had some hardware flaws that weren't critical, but still a pain in the neck. The most notorious issue was the one called Red Ring of Death. Here's the thing, the first revisions of the Xbox 360 would constantly overheat due to cooling problems. Overheating could easily knock the console out of service, which was indicated by 3 red lights. All of this could happen outrageously suddenly. You come home from school, uni, or work, turn on your freshly bought white gaming box only to see it winking at you with red lights as if saying, "No games today, pal." In addition, there was no HDMI port on the basic model of the console, though the commercials clearly said a full HD. The hard drive also appeared only on the later versions, but in comparison to overheating, those were minor inconveniences that were ignored in order to enter the market as quickly as possible. And the result was worth it. Xbox 360 beat the PS3 by a full year by hitting the shelves in late 2005. Microsoft even tried to make up for the disappointing Japanese market launch by cooperating with the father of the Final Fantasy series, Hironobu Sakaguchi. But alas, in the end, nothing really worked out. Anyway, let's rewind what awesome games were there.
Jack, rip that door.
I'll begin with a title as important to the console and its genre as Halo was for the original Xbox. I'm talking about the famous 3D shooter Gears of War, which blew our minds with its dynamic and brutal action. It offered us everything we could expect from such a game: crazy gunfights, cool and tough characters, improved graphics, and most importantly, co-op. Single player was also an option, of course, but not only did co-op bring more fun, the local AI was designed to deal with really fierce offensives from several players. So unless you had a death wish, the game's tactical elements were also designed for more than one player. However, even alone, there was plenty of fun stuff to do. You had to jump from one cover to another, shoot back, and annihilate the enemies in close combat. Even the trivial reloading process had some sort of a minigame. If you managed to press the reloading button an extra time, the process would accelerate and the protagonist would get a damage bonus. Should you fail to do that, the weapon would jam. And thanks to the epic plot about the war between humanity and the Locust Horde, a race of reptile-like creatures, the shooter kept you on edge of your seat until you beat it in one sitting. As a result, Gears of War won numerous awards, was later released on PC, and of course spawned a whole series of sequels that became iconic for the entire genre. Speaking of Halo, that series was making progress as well. We got a whole bunch of games with every part being more interesting than the previous. Halo 3 was the precipice of everything that happened in the entire series. It had an extremely intense and emotional campaign and an impeccable multiplayer. Halo Wars showed us that a great shooter can be turned into an equally great strategy game. One could reasonably ask, why? But it was a success, and that is all that matters. Halo Reach was sort of Bungie's farewell to the series, and the tragic atmosphere of its plot, which told the backstory of the original game, emphasized it perfectly. It would seem that the series should have ended there, but then Part 4 came out, accomplishing the seemingly impossible task of continuing the story without dropping the bar of quality. Naturally, the approach of the new developers affected the way you felt Halo. For example, the multiplayer now used its own maps instead of levels from the story mode. This changed, compiled with the others, caused a lot of talk about Halo turning into Call of Duty. Though in the end, it turned out that the new line of development didn't spoil the enjoyment of the game one bit.
Wake up, Chief.
Another highly anticipated sequel was Fable 2. In its core, it remained the same engrossing fairy tale as the original, but the sequel was larger in almost every aspect. For example, the in-game world was as enchantingly magical as in the first game, only it became several times larger and had better graphics. The story was once again built around a revenge-seeking hero whom we controlled since his childhood, only the storytelling was way more grand and epic. However, all the seriousness was smothered by the first cutscene, where we see a sparrow flying over various realms with insanely epic music playing in the background. The bird then reaches a rooftop of some high building only to cinematically shit on the protagonist. Welcome to the amazing fairy tale by Peter Molyneux. One of the interesting innovations was the protagonist's follower in the form of a very cute dog. The furry friend not only pleased all the pet lovers, but was also extremely useful in fighting against enemies and searching for valuable loot. The main feature of Fable was still there as well. The protagonist would take part in numerous events and make numerous choices, all of which affected the in-game world, his reputation, and the attitude of those around him. Long story short, Fable 2 was made as a classic sequel, striving to take the best from the original and multiply it.
It doesn't matter who you are or what you're driving, okay? Bring your ride and bring your friends and just get down here now, okay? It's day one of the greatest festival on earth and we are gonna have some fun this year, yes!
An opposite tactic was chosen by the developers of Forza when they made a spin-off to the series called Horizon. If previously the series was focused solely on recreating the experience of sports racing competitions on real track and under real rules, now we were presented with the open world street racing. According to the story, the protagonist arrived at the Horizon Festival to take part in the races. Obviously, he wanted to become the best, but the current leader didn't see him as a worthy opponent. Thus, our hero begins his long and arduous journey to success by winning races. Sounds a bit Need for Speed-ish, but only at the first glance. Forza retained its attention to details that create the experience of participating in a large-scale competition. For example, the player would earn special bracelets of different colors that showed his status in comparison to other drivers. To obtain them, you had to win in the festival races, which required a car of a certain level. Apart from all that, there were illegal races that ignored the rules of the festival, showcase events where you could be put up against, say, a hot air balloon, and many other elements that created this peculiar world of street racing. Of course, multiplayer was there as well. It would be weird if they didn't allow us to explore this gorgeous day and night change supporting world with other players, who, by the way, had divided into two camps. Ones liked the new approach to the series, while the others were saying that Forza is about a different kind of stuff and it doesn't need all these simplifications. However, given that Horizon is now released along with the original Motorsports, I'm sure that in the end everybody was satisfied. Our team highly recommends playing this series, especially the fourth part, which is also available on PC.
How's your car running?
Papers.
By the way, since I've already mentioned Need for Speed, why not saying a couple of words about Most Wanted? the part considered by everyone to be the best in the franchise. All the more since its Xbox 360 version looked way better than ports for other platforms. If by any chance you're not familiar with this racing classic, then firstly, how in the world did you manage to miss it? And secondly, in a nutshell, here's what the game was all about. In the ever-autumnal city of Rockport, there was a blacklist of the 15 most wanted racers. Our characters would come to town and begin to move up this annual career ladder when suddenly his, I dare say it, world-famous BMW M3 GTR was sabotaged and taken away by the antagonist named Razor. So we had to start our path all the way from the very bottom. After that, the game offered you mad adrenaline races, dynamic police chases, sick tuning, although a bit less sick than before, and most important for me personally, the best soundtrack in the whole series.
Fresh out the house, got the beat. As I ride up and down Martin Luther.
The previous parts also had good music, but the feeling of passing a sharp turn in a painted Mustang at breakneck speed while Disturbed or Prodigy are blasting in the background, that, let me tell you, was awesome. I think I know what I'm going to play today after this video. In the meantime, let's get back to the Xbox 360. One of the console advantages, at least marketing-wise, was the Kinect camera, which became available in 2010. It was used as an auxiliary device, allowing you to control characters, menus, and pretty much everything else using your body. Thanks to the two cameras and the infrared sensor, Kinect was able to measure the depth of the image, which on one hand expanded the camera's functionality, but on the other hand increased its price to an unpleasant $150. But these are all details. In a nutshell, we had a small black box in front of which we had to repeat the actions shown on screen. For example, your Shape Fitness Evolved allowed you to work out using this technology, while Kinectimals allowed you to spend more time cuddling with virtual pets. In theory, all of that sounded awesome, yet a little weird for other people in your household, but in practice, there were certain nuances. The first red flag came from Peter Molyneux himself. His studio made a lot of fuss with its Kinect project, which, judging by the demo, allowed quite realistic and diverse interactions with virtual person. It seemed to be some sort of unfathomable fiction, and it remained as such because the project quickly fell off the map. Later, it turned out that the technology actually worked, albeit with some problems regarding motion and voice recognition. In 2010, it took nothing to excuse such a device for having a minor flaw like this if it didn't make certain titles almost unplayable. For example, the hoverboard racing game Sonic Free Riders looked quite decent, but the characters were barely controllable. Despite that, the player only had to bend and jump. The biggest problem, however, was that with this format, even the best games were unable to keep the player engaged for long. Kinect adventures that came with a camera offered some fun quests, with each one being only a few minutes long. Though, of course, there were some pleasant exceptions like the Just Dance game series, which got the Kinect support on the Xbox. Each part of the series was about dancing to all kinds of popular songs. The game was able to read its players' movements pretty well, while the songs ranged from easy and upbeat to truly challenging. Perhaps the only downside to Just Dance was the fact that anyone could try it simply by playing a song and dancing to it. Still, having such a fun party game was more of an exception, and in general Kinect turned out to be a failure, albeit being rather innovative.
LeVar, you gonna let those bitches disrespect us?
Shit, what you think?
The console had more success with traditional titles than with risky ventures. Take Saints Row for example, another exclusive third-person shooter. It seemed that once again we had a game about gang wars and street life set in a fictional yet realistic American city. In a word, another GTA clone.
Oh shit, here we go again.
But upon closer inspection, the game turned out to be not a clone, but rather a decent competitor. For example, relating yourself to the protagonist was much easier, as you had to create him yourself. The story was still linear, but with a grain of variability. You could choose which missions will lead the protagonist to a necessary point in the plot. The game also had a reputation system reminiscent of Fable, so you couldn't just beat everyone you meet into a pulp without having to face the consequences. The main thing I remember about Saints Row is that playing this game was pure pleasure because shooting, driving, and map controls were convenient as hell. I can't say that the game one-upped GTA, but what I can say is that the Xbox had a great alternative to it. Another thing worth playing on our today's console was Ninja Gaiden 2. Yes, the modern version of good old Ninja Gaiden that made us die countless times back on Dandy. The series had been rebooted back on the original Xbox, while the second part, which was released on the 360, was not only hardcore and demanding, but also fun and player-friendly, like any decent sequel. The essence of the game hasn't changed since the 8-bit era. Only now, it wasn't a platformer, but a slasher with a good combat system which was complemented by fairly smart enemies and tons of gore. All of that put Ninja Gaiden 2 almost on the same level with Devil May Cry in terms of style. Now add a variety of weapons, abilities, and cool bosses, and you got yourself an awesome game. One may ask why it's better to play the Xbox version of this game instead of, say, its redux for PS3. Because the original was much more fun and interesting, that's why. For example, in the PS3 version, the number of enemies was reduced to improve the frame rate, and to compensate that, the remaining enemies got inflated health bars. All the gore was censored, which is why the field of battle often got covered with purple smoke. The balance also changed drastically, which affected both the game's difficulty and economy. All in all, it's still playable, but why bother when there's a better version without unnecessary changes?
They told me, son, you're special. You were born to do great things. You know what? They were right.
Of course, the 7th generation of consoles had multi-platform games that remained loyal to themselves. As a part of today's video, I'd like to mention BioShock, especially since it was released for Xbox 360 a year earlier than for Sony's console. As one of the developers said in an interview, the version for the PS3 wasn't even planned in the first place. So what we have here is another shooter, first person this time. Here's the synopsis. The protagonist, with quite an original name, Jack, ends up in an underwater city of Rapture as a result of a plane crash. The city was designed as a utopia to create an ideal society, but naturally, things went sideways. Firstly, the city's creator turned out to be a sketchy individual with questionable motivation, and secondly, the superpower-given substance called Adam was discovered. All of this turned the city into ruins full of dangers and puzzles, which we had to explore. It is worth mentioning that BioShock was perfectly constructed as a shooter. Among other advantages, I'd mentioned the decent leveling system, combat variability, and beautiful design locations. The game's main advantage, however, was the deep story that touched on the topics of moral dilemmas, the oppressants and the oppressed, dystopias, and much more. I'm sure you can still find numerous long reads written by the players about what thoughts did the game provoke in their minds. From this point of view, BioShock was not just a good game, but a true work of philosophy that showed us what was next gen back then. To wrap it up, the Xbox 360 was a great console both in terms of the device itself and the games it offered. By the way, I almost forgot to mention that the console supported backward compatibility with many titles from the original Xbox, so Microsoft made a console that wasn't exactly a correction of mistakes, but rather a quintessence of experience accumulated over 2 generations. This allowed not only to catch up with Sony, the longtime market leader, but to successfully compete with it and even be ahead of it in some ways. However, the moment was spoiled by another Japanese company, which will be the topic of our next video.
It came from the 3rd dimension, with its own brain.
Nintendo has always been known for its love of finding new ways to play video games. Whether it is the ancient Virtual Boy, which tried its best to be a VR headset, or the modern Nintendo Labo, which turns cardboard into costly controllers. So after the GameCube, the company went back to that shtick. In the very first presentation of Wii, which back then was called Revolution, Nintendo put forward a new way of interacting with the player and said that power isn't what makes a good console. And right they were, because Wii's hardware wasn't exactly the best when compared to its 7th generation counterparts. The new way of interaction was, of course, the new controller, Wii Remote or Wiimote for short. At first glance, it differed from the controllers we were used to, resembling something between a TV remote and a landline telephone, but upon a closer inspection, it turned out to be an excellent motion controller equipped with accelerometer, speaker, vibration feedback, and even gyroscope in later versions. Some games required a second controller with a funny name, Nunchuk, which could be wired to the main one. The resulting construction allowed very precise motion capture, making the playing process more than comfortable. By the way, fun fact, they first started making Wiimote back for the GameCube. A prototype even popped up at the auction in 2018. However, given the history of both consoles, it's good that the project was delayed. The Wii inherited a whole library of video games from its predecessors. However, this applies only to the first version of the console. It certainly is a damn shame that the new models were deprived of this feature, but even without it, there was still much to play. Unlike the PS3 and Xbox 360, which often shared games with one another, the Wii, largely because of its peculiar controller, locked itself within exclusives on one hand, as each port required a complete rework of the controls, and stood out for its unique project on the other. The multi-platform titles that managed to survive the porting often had unique features that increased interest to the Wii version, and since the development process of our today's console went smoothly and quietly, I suggest we move on to the games. Let's start with the new Mario, shall we? It's Nintendo after all. Now, of course, more than one part of the series was released on Wii, but I'll focus on Super Mario Galaxy. The synopsis of this 3D platformer was as follows. Bowser once again kidnapped Princess Peach. While to stop him, our beloved plumber finds himself on a remote planet from where he starts his journey through other galaxies. However, those were no ordinary worlds with weird flora and fauna. The player could be sent on a tiny ball with gravity, which he could easily run around the Ecuador on a cube with question panels instead of faces, and all of it was held together around a black hole with the passage from very first Mario in the background. The player could even end up on a giant stonefish, swimming in the ocean of space. As for the gameplay, the developers did what they do best. They took a well-tried formula, brought it up to perfection. As in Mario 64, the player had to gather stars in various quests in order to reach the end of the story. To this end, the developers made a whole arsenal of abilities, which included classics like jumping in every direction, swimming, ground pound, and as well some new tricks like the ability to spin around to stun the enemies. The player could also get additional gameplay options by picking up character power-ups. For example, the game had the Fire Mario suit from the first games in the series, which allowed Mario to throw small fireballs. As you would expect, the whole thing was controlled with the Wiimote, with all its features. For example, you had to shake the joystick to spin and drag the virtual crosshair manually to collect the scattered star bits. Such controls seemed odd at first, but the first hour of the game showed that everything was convenient and responsive. The rest hardly needs any commentary. The graphics, the levels, and especially the soundtrack were done at the highest level. Even if you, like myself, are not a die-hard fan of Mario adventures, I would still recommend Galaxy as an extremely high-quality 3D platformer. Speaking of Mario, it would be a crime not to mention the exclusive Mario Kart Wii of the Mario Kart series. The essence of the game is known for anyone who at least once has played any racing game with karts, which are small, flat racing cars. We were given a set of cartoonish characters from both Mario and Donkey Kong universe, a set of themed tracks, and a number of power-ups to boost yourself and throwables to attack other races. That's it. Push the pedal to the metal. However, despite the rather hackneyed gameplay formula, the Wii part was quite fun to play, especially in multiplayer. To control the character, the player had to use the same Wiimote, only instead of holding it like a remote, he had to dual wield it like an 8-bit console joystick. The interesting thing about Mario Kart was the steering wheel that it came with. In a nutshell, it was just a piece of plastic with a place to put the Wiimote in. It didn't exactly help the steering, but the illusion of a wireless floating steering wheel was amusing at the very least. As for the innovations, the game all of a sudden offered you to drive motorcycles, which were slightly different in characteristics. Also, the characters roster had been expanded, plus the game got the online service support for the console, so you could compete online, at least until the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection service was shut down in 2014. All in all, it's certainly not Need for Speed or Forza, but still enough to have some fun with your friends. Mario is great and all, but surprisingly, the biggest hit of the Wii wasn't Mario, nor even Zelda, which I'll get to in a bit. It was Wii Sports, which came with the console. It was a collection of sports simulators that included tennis, baseball, golf, bowling, and boxing. It seemed to be nothing special. We've seen such games even back in the 8-bit era, but here it was all about the controls that changed everything. For example, in tennis the player had to swing the remote like a racket, while the console processed the force in the direction of the swing. In bowling, the player had to imitate the throw of a ball, and in boxing the game asked you to take the joystick in your hand and start smashing virtual faces. There were also a few other goodies, like the simple rating system that showed the player's skill in various sports, and the support for console avatars called Me. Despite the fact that it was far from a Bioshock level masterpiece, Wii Sports was a great success, as evidenced by its enormous sales. The novelty of the controls and the fact that the game came bundled with the console played a big part in this. But the success was mostly due to the game's focus on an extremely wide audience. Simplistic sports simulators that need you to swing the joystick in front of the screen could easily amuse children, were accessible and understandable for the older audience, and didn't irritate even the hardened gamers like you and me. Actually, we became quite popular with fitness sports, etc., which resulted in not only various titles, but also unusual accessories. The console got a whole bunch of different joystick attachments that imitated clubs, rackets, pistols, fishing rods, and whatever you can think of. Here we should also mention the classic controller, intended for those who weren't interested in all the motion games but wanted decent controls. The pinnacle of sports and recreational thinking, however, was the Wii Balance Board, a small board that had several weights to determine the player's center of gravity. One may ask, and why in the world would a console need that? So I'll give an example. Just like Wii Sports allowed us to box using our hands, so did this thing, which allowed us to, say, ski by leaning left or right. You could do that with Wii Fit, one of the few titles that supported the balance board. In a nutshell, it was also a collection of athletic disciplines, only a bit more workout oriented. There were 4 categories: yoga, strength training, aerobics, and balance games. And in each one you could find a whole bunch of exercises, ranging from snowboard balancing to the downward facing dog pose. I kid you not. Google it if you don't believe me. All jokes aside, Wii Fit was a really fun thing to keep yourself in shape. For those who like running without leaving the sofa, our today's console had exclusive Sonic games. Back in the day, just the existence of such games caused quite a hoo-ha. To think Sonic himself and exclusively for Nintendo. However, in the future the Hedgehog will have to deal with worse things. If you don't mind, I'll skip the Secret Rings, which took us on a journey through the world of 1001 Nights with some really inconvenient controls, and the Black Knight, which all of a sudden armed the series characters with swords and armor. Instead, I'll tell you about Sonic Colors, which wasn't a weirdish spin-off, but a rightful part of the main storyline. In it, Dr. Eggman created a huge interstellar amusement park, and not just another Disneyland, but a whole system of united planets. Of course, nobody asked the inhabitants of these planets, the multicolored wisps, who possess great energy. Sonic, like any normal hero, wasn't happy about all this and set off on a speedy journey to the Doctor's base. The gameplay, in its core, hasn't changed since the past parts of the series. You run, jump, attack enemies, and use boost. Wisps were this part's shtick. They granted Sonic various extra abilities like digging through the ground, flying, sticking to walls, and so on. The idea proved to be so cool that wisps can be found in almost every game of the franchise starting from Colors, although it hardly adds up with the storyline. All in all, the levels were somewhat too straight and the plot wasn't that fascinating, but otherwise, Colors was a great game about Sonic's adventures, worth of getting yourself a Wii, if not for the recent remaster for all the platforms. So I suggest taking a closer look at it. However, Wii's game library didn't consist solely of family-friendly stuff. Fans of harsh and brutal games were in for a treat as well. Take Red Steel 2, for example, a first-person shooter where you can both shoot and use your katana. The first installment was solid, but rather boring, while the totally unrelated second one fascinated with its strange mixture of a Western and a Japanese action movie. This alone was enough to spark interest because an Asian sheriff coming out of a saloon only to disappear in a grove of sakuras was rather unusual. We won't be speculating on what substances were used by the developers. Instead, let's say a couple words about the combat system, which was exceptionally good. Decent cowboy gunfights were one thing, but close combat was just pure fencing madness. Of course, you had to work both with virtual hands and your own. The game was great at reading your movements. You could perform various lunges, parries, and charge attacks if you swing really hard. The main task was not to smash the TV in the process. Also, Red Steel 2 had some nice cell shading, which we always can't get enough of. The game to one-up Red Steel 2 in brutality was Mad World. This hack and slash is so bloody and gory that visually there are literally 3 colors: white, black, and red. The gameplay was designed to match that, and we were playing as an ex-military, now mercenary, who will use literally anything he can find to slaughter his enemies. Barrels, road signs, various transport, and of course the main weapon, Chainsaw Glove. As you've probably guessed, the controls also required you to move around in front of the screen. But when the game asks you not to kick a ball, but to spin an enemy and throw him in a garbage container, that's a whole different experience. There was also a story somewhere in there. A small town gets cut off from the world, the virus has been spread into the air, whoever kills the most people will get a vaccine. The hell with it. I'd rather launch another dummy into a burning tank in all this black and white and red trash. It's easy to forget that we're still talking about Nintendo console. Perhaps if Mad World had a slightly more varied gameplay that didn't get boring after a couple of hours, it would share the same stage with Carmageddon that had similar features for light-headed fun. So far, we've talked about family-friendly titles as well as the brutal ones, which means that right now, it's time for something epic. To my mind, the best Wii game of this kind was an RPG called Xenoblade Chronicles. It immersed us in the story of a very unusual world that consists of an endless ocean and the bodies of 2 titans who died fighting each other. On these bodies appeared organic and mechanical life forms, which of course also started fighting each other. Couldn't have been otherwise. The game's protagonist, named Shulk, was lucky to find an extremely powerful energy sword, and here started the huge adventure that could easily drag you in for tens of hours. Design-wise, Xenoblade resembled an MMORPG, huge locations, unique art style, epic story, and much more that made it clear that we were dealing with a huge work of art, not a small indie game. It was even surprising how all this beauty ran on relatively weak Wii. Xenoblade Chronicles also recently got a remaster that improved gameplay and graphics, so now you can partake this legendary RPG with a design even better than the original. And since I started this video with Mario, it will only be fair to wrap it up with Zelda. Apart from the Twilight Princess port from GameCube, which was quite good and worth players' attention, the Wii received an exclusive called Skyward Sword. On the exterior, it was a classic Zelda with exploration, puzzles, and enemies, except that the interchange between dungeons and the open world has been reworked, and now most of the world was like one huge dungeon. The story was another equally classic prequel that provided some more answers to the question, what has brought us to the previous games in the series? I know it's hard to believe, but the game's main feature was the controls. However, if before games would you just say, look, now you can wave your hands instead of pressing the buttons, Skyward Sword was able to make the Wiimote achieve its full potential. Every hand movement was tracked perfectly, which allowed to create enemies that required a precise attack to be defeated. Other items, like the slingshot, also actively used motion control, and I'm not talking about the virtual cross here, I'm talking about gyroscopes and accelerometers. To do this, the game required the Motion Plus extension, which at first had to be attached to the Wiimote, but later versions had it by default. By the way, the limited edition of Zelda had a golden joystick with the extension already built in. Actually, Skyward Sword was so confident with its feature that Link, debatably the most famous left-handed video game character, turned right-handed for this game for the sake of sword controls. That is, here we had a small revolution in motion controls. Basically, the Wii itself was a revolution, fully justifying its original name. Here, the already familiar games got a new perspective, which made even the usual virtual golf interesting and fun. Nintendo yet again showed us that they're not just filling the market, they're pushing the industry forward. And eventually, they left the 7th generation console competition for their own field, all while winning at least in sales. Yes, surprisingly, the Wii, being less powerful and lacking the ability to port sensational blockbusters without shamanistic rituals, sold 101 million consoles, leaving the PS3 and Xbox 360 behind with 87 and 84 million respectively. Of course, there's a lot of nuances, as we have to take into account the success of games on the console, its lower price, but in my opinion, it's still a worthy reason to be proud. If you remember, I started the video about PlayStation 2 by saying that the development started with some sort of a creative impasse, when the devs simply didn't know how to develop their new product. It seems like Sony hasn't really learned much since then. Now, of course, who am I to call out the industry's titan for its incompetence? But the very first presentation of the future console at E3 2005 turned out to be a 2-hour ramble about how greatly performative the new console will be. 2 HDMI ports, 3 Ethernet ports, awesome trailers for Killzone, F1 and MotorStorm. If they didn't turn out to be obvious pre-rendered fakes, everything would have been great. There were no actual demos of any games, as well as the console's prototype, so the PS3 didn't come out until 2006. Here, they showed actual gameplay of several games, which, expectedly, was much more humble than last year's commercials and the PlayStation itself. The price was also announced, $600 for the full version and $500 for the stripped down version that had a smaller hard drive, no HDMI, card reader or Wi-Fi. So here's the question, why on earth would anyone splash out for it when there's already the tested Xbox 360 that costs only $300? The price could be justified by the console's hardware, but it had a certain nuance. The PS3 indeed came out quite powerful, no point denying that. For a while, there was a rumor that a scientist from Massachusetts used PS3 cluster systems to assemble a supercomputer for the research and simulation of black holes. The paradox is that usual computers of the same computing power would have costed a fortune in comparison with such method. And apparently, the third PlayStation was made exactly for scientists, because all the developers were wailing about the overly complicated architecture of the console. They just couldn't make use of all the immense power that was teased in presentations, which led to the PS3 ports often getting downgraded graphics and frame rate. The famous Gabe Newell, in one of his interviews, advised Sony to scrap everything and start from scratch. That's how bad it was. In addition, the first version of the console would constantly overheat and break down. How could they not? So the company had to spend a good amount of time simply finishing and polishing their brainchild. This even affected the gamepad, which had a shtick of determining its position in space, but at first was lacking the familiar vibration function due to patent disputes. Well, at least it wasn't the bent variant, concepts of which got leaked sometime prior. I mean, you can't even throw this thing into the wall, it would fly right back. The PS3 also stood out for its psychedelic commercials inherited from its predecessors. For example, how about that one commercial that shows a baby doll sitting in an empty room in front of the console? When the doll starts crying and the console starts floating, you can't help but wonder if David Lynch was at it again. But I've got too much focus on Sony's mistakes. After all, they had to be proud of as well. For example, the PlayStation 3 was in demand as a cheap, affordable, quality Blu-ray player. I remember that a lot of people were interested in the console not only for its main purpose, but also for the ability to watch high-res movies. The games were also good, especially when Sony had polished the console and the developers had learned how to handle it.
Jimmy, just stay back! Jimmy, I am warning you! Go!
Take The Last of Us, for example, which came out at the sunset of the support for the third PlayStation. I'm sure everyone has at least heard about it, especially considering the notorious sequel, but just in case, let me remind you of the synopsis. In this third-person action-adventure, we play as a smuggler named Joel, living or rather surviving in a post-apocalyptic America. Most of humanity went extinct due to an infestation of a dangerous fungus. All coincidences with real events are coincidental. The story then develops like a great Hollywood action movie with drama and plot twists. And I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with it by at least watching a video, or better yet, playing the game yourself. The in-game world, both story-wise and gameplay-wise, feels alive and realistic. Take, for example, the local stealth. The sections where you have to sneak past unnoticed are quite intense, and it is perfectly justified by the events and the setting. Graphics-wise, the game was also great, squeezing that initially promised potential from the console.
You see this? Shh, don't scare it.
I won't.
What are you doing?
It's alright. Come here.
Speaking of the PS3, it should be said that not every great title was released at the end of the console's lifecycle. Naughty Dog, who made The Last of Us, released the Uncharted series before. It was a no less great adventure action about treasure hunting, locations exploring, and acrobatics on rocks, lianas, and other natural objects. I got acquainted with Uncharted much later than I should have, when Tomb Raider had already been rebooted for the second time, and my first impressions of the gameplay were like, now these are the adventures of Lara Croft that we lost. By the way, the game's protagonist named Nathan Drake seemed even more interesting because he was much more agile, easier to control, and would constantly give comments and jokes about what's going on.
Well, if it isn't the beautiful and talented Elena Fisher.
Flattery will get you screen time.
Yeah, I'm more of a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. Victor Sullivan.
Huh.
For Christ's sakes.
As for the adventures themselves, again, I can say that in the first part, Nathan is searching for El Dorado, in the second one he follows in the footsteps of Marco Polo, and in the third game he explores the mysteries of his ancestor Francis Drake. But it's better to immerse in the story yourself. After all, Naughty Dog has some weak sides, but storytelling certainly isn't one of them. Another example of an even more thrilling story was Heavy Rain. It's a detective story about finding a serial killer who leaves origami at the crime scenes. The premise of the game is obscenely simple. There's a certain action on the screen, like one long cutscene, and occasionally buttons for contextual actions pop up, resembling QuickTime events. But as in real life, a failed action does not result in a game over. Instead, the story continues, suggesting, as in Morrowind, that you persist in the doomed world you have created. Thanks to this, Heavy Rain can rightfully be called an interactive movie. At the same time, the actions required from the player did not feel like a random set of buttons shoved into a cutscene. Everything was always coherent and tied to what was happening at the moment, so you simply couldn't get enough of it. The immersion was heavily complemented by the PS Move controller, which was added just a week after the game's release. Speaking of the controller, it was the obvious response to Nintendo's Wiimote with roughly the same functionality. It too was tracking movements, allowing you to aim and wave your hands to perform virtual actions. The main difference between them I would call rather subjective. The movement tracking seemed to be a bit more precise, the shape was a bit more convenient than that of a rectangular Wiimote, and PS Move also had a funny glowing ball that helped the console to track the position of the controller in space. No, really, I could spend quite some time watching that thing glowing. In some games, you also had to wield the DualShock to move the character, but this problem was solved by Nintendo's nunchuck, by PlayStation's navigation controller. Move supported a whole bunch of games, among which you could find trivial sports simulators and shooting galleries, as well as major titles. For example, I personally found Resident Evil 5 not that interesting, but playing it with motion control was actually quite fun. But back to Heavy Rain. This feature intensified the immersion effect because now you had not only to respond to the hints on screen, but to actually move. Such a seemingly insignificant detail made the already fascinating narrative even more exciting. A different kind of atmosphere was in Siren Blood Curse, a rethinking of the famous Forbidden Siren with an addition of the mechanics from its sequel and new ideas. At first glance, it was a classic horror about a group of journalists who went to a Japanese village and found a group of very interesting young people who spent their free time sacrificing others. There was also a number of questionable decisions, such as somewhat lacerated storytelling through episode and jumps from one character to another, combat system that made fighting monsters a lot easier, tons of hints, and much more. But most importantly, the game was actually damn scary, what made it quite addictive. There was some magic in the masterfully made darkness, the character animations, the soundtrack, and even the episodic storytelling eventually turned out to be a creepy and well-crafted investigation. For the closest thing to this horror game is Silent Hill. When you play the game, follow the events, and after a couple of hours, you just can't escape the rushing atmosphere of a Japanese horror. Speaking of titles with a deep plot, it's illegal not to mention Metal Gear Solid. Unlike other major installments of the series, Part 4 never made it beyond the PS3, which is a damn shame really, because it is actually an awesome game. That tactical spy action, which MGS has always been, reached its climax by moving directly to the battlefield. And that's not just the setting description. During the development process, the game's slogan was "No place to hide." According to the story, the world is torn by war, which is why Solid Snake has to take cover not in the cramped spaces and not even in the woods, but right in the middle of the battlefield. To this end, of course, the variety of gadgets was expanded once again. For example, the new suit allowed you to mimic the texture of the surface the character was pressed against, which oftentimes allowed you to hide in plain sight. The story also reached its climax. Over the many years the series has been around, there were multiple storylines, and almost all of them have come to a logical end here. Even the look of the aged Snake himself hinted the conclusion of the series. All in all, this is definitely a game worth buying the third PlayStation even today.
On the Little Big Planet, you're a little sack person. This one is you? Oh, bless. You're quite a cute one.
But enough about serious titles for grown-ups. For example, back in the day, a game called Little Big Planet was no less anticipated than MGS4. It was a puzzle platformer about small rag people named Sackboy, or Sackgirl if you prefer female characters. The gameplay brought back the warm memories of 8-bit two-dimensional adventures, and the atmosphere was much more cute. Everything in the game is made of cardboard, rocks, ropes, and various improvised materials in general, with their relatively realistic physics. In addition to the feeling of handcrafted locations, it also allowed you to interact with almost every piece of environment. For example, if there was a pile of rubble ahead, you could declutter it, and then use stuff from the pile to climb higher or activate the scales. All of that sounds cool, but the best thing they did in Little Big Planet was the level creator. Here's where your imagination could run wild, which is why some creative player used it to recreate Mirror's Edge, Jurassic Park, and even a working calculator. It's even a little strange that it wasn't a Nintendo game. An equally unique game was Gran Turismo 5, just a trivial racing simulator it would seem, but with this game I don't even know where to begin. For starters, let's take the remarkable 5-minute intro, which shows us the world of professional racing from the factory where the car parts are made all the way to the racing track. You might think, who in their right mind would take so much time before letting the player into the game? But in this case, it felt like an appropriate opening for a massive project. Now, some fast facts. The game has more than 1,000 cars, although 800 of them came from the previous part, but still, insanely realistic physics with damage models and a whole mountain of various models. You could start with quick races or the career mode, then an hour later find yourself making beautiful pictures of cars from replays, and 2 hours later disappear into the B-Spec mode where you take the role of the director of a racing team. Yes, here you could not only drive yourself, but also manage a team of virtual racers, analyzing their behavior and influencing it with various recommendations. Gran Turismo 5 is truly a colossal title. And since we're talking about unique titles, how can we possibly not say anything about Journey? Technically, it's another movie game like Heavy Rain, but of an entirely different kind. Instead of the usual cutscenes or even gameplay that would introduce us to the characters, here, the player can find a very meditative journey, just as the title says. Essentially, all you have to do is to walk through a desert. But each player will take something different from the experience. Maybe Journey will inspire you to move forward until you reach your goal, or make you think about the cyclical nature of everything around you. Even if all you get out of it is an hour and a half of admiring the scenery, I would still recommend spending them and undertaking this journey for yourself. As usual, a great chunk of the console's hits consisted of all kinds of shooters. Here we can say a couple of words about Renaissance: Fall of Man, a first-person shooter about an alternative history of the 20th century. In a nutshell, the 1917 revolution in Russia was crushed, so the Soviet Union never happened and the country closed its borders. Then falls the Tunguska meteorite, which begins to affect the climate and nature around it. But there's no information about the event until hordes of evil mutants start dispersing from within the country, whom players have to fight all the way on the British Isles. And you said that all aliens and monsters happen to appear in New York? The most memorable feature was the game's weapons. Contrary to the standard bundle of pistols, rifle, shotgun, players were given extremely creative guns that greatly enhanced the tactical options, and they actually came in handy in the fight against smart and cunning opponents, whose design, by the way, also pleased with its diversity. And perhaps that's the strongest side of Resistance, is that it was a shit ton of fun gameplay-wise. Of course, such a project was bound to have sequels, and if the second part came out just good, the third part managed to develop the advantages of the original and became a great action game that made a lot of noise in its time.
We were fighting for our very existence. But if there are those who would deny us peace...
Killzone 2, on the other hand, wasn't about unusual gameplay, but the beauty of its execution. It was another first-person shooter with the gentleman's feature kit of its time. Vehicles, shelters, interface without a health bar, everything is right on trend. The story also didn't stand out for any unusual details. A dystopian future where humanity is exploring space and naturally encounters a hostile alien race. In the first part, we repelled the attack, which is why now we are the ones acting on the offensive. Thanks to this, players were introduced to the planet Helgen, and I've gotta say that its landscapes were actually impressive. Of course, I'm not talking about the aesthetics of garbage piles and radioactive terrain, although there was something in it as well, but about the lighting, details, and special effects. Perhaps the only game able to compete with Killzone 2 in terms of graphics was Metal Gear Solid 4. Another thing worth mentioning is physics that allowed enemies to perform impressive somersaults even in death. And all this didn't lag or stutter even in the most intense scenes. Makes you remember all these stories about the power of PS3.
What are you doing? Dave is not coming. Ignore him. Come on, we gotta get this thing ready before we dock. Let's go.
Speaking of hardware-intensive games, how can we leave aside the legendary GTA 4? The fourth part got completely overshadowed by the fifth part and San Andreas, which is actually an awful injustice. The game's protagonist, with the characteristic Serbian name Niko Belic, used to be a criminal element, like the franchise's other protagonists, but unlike his predecessors, he moved to Liberty City in search of the American dream. He was invited there by his cousin Roman, the man, the myth, the bowling enthusiasts.
Nico, it's Roman.
No.
Let's go.
Wrong.
Gameplay-wise, GTA 4 could be described as same stuff, but better. More car driving, shooting, and completing missions, but with a whole bunch of innovations from the ability to choose a mission to an online mode, all with a great emphasis on realism. Perhaps the fourth part was missing that good old farce and madness, but other than that, it's undoubtedly a worthy successor in the series. I would like to end today's video with Infamous, an action game that became a great superhero simulator. Here we play as Cole McGrath, who was caught at ground zero of a massive explosion that granted him the ability of electrokinesis. Unlike licensed superhero games of the time, which tried to stretch the character's abilities to the game situations, here, various supernatural skills served both movement and combat systems. This allowed the player to shoot lightning, fly, glide on wires, use energy in melee combat, and all of that was extremely convenient to perform. As for the weak sides, I personally would mention the story, which wasn't bad, but can hardly be called outstanding as well, and the karma system, which can be described as a good guy should spare the defeated while the bad one will finish him, and it didn't even affect the playthrough that much. However, all of this was overshadowed by the extremely fun gameplay, which stood out for its combat. The set of abilities and the convenience of controls allowed for constant experimentation and change of playstyle, keeping you engaged until the end credits. So what I'm saying is, despite the fact that Sony screwed up absolutely everything, the PS3 is remembered for its great titles, especially exclusives. Of course, the console didn't exactly blow up the market as its predecessors did, but it certainly wasn't a failure either. Moreover, the mistakes allowed the company to learn how to interact with the audience and work with the next gen, which can be seen in the success of the PS4, which is still relevant for a number of reasons. As for the third PlayStation, all that's left is to invite you to the comments to share your memories about the console. As always, please leave a like, a subscribe for more content. By now, we've touched base on every gaming console from 8-bit ones to the platforms of today, and even said a couple of words about PCs. But our gaming experience is certainly much larger than that. There are still many more interesting topics to cover, I's to dot and T's to cross, so remember to tune in next time.